The Senate Judiciary Committee met Thursday to examine the issue of U.S. counterterrorism policy. FBI Director Louis Freeh, former CIA Director James Woolsey, and former UN Ambassador Jeane Kirkpatrick were among those who testified. Senator Orrin Hatch chairs the 3-hour, 15-minute hearing.
We're convened this morning to examine U.S. counterterrorism policy in the wake of the despicable attacks on our embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. At the outset, let me just say how much I commend the FBI Director, Louis Freeh, and his agency for their outstanding work, and I might say the entire FBI in this matter, in responding to the bombings in Africa. The swift and capable work of the FBI and the CIA, I might add, and in some respects the diplomatic corps, all in partnership, and I might add the foreign governments, all in partnership in investigating these crimes and beginning the process of bringing the perpetrators to justice, sends an unmistakable message that terrorism will not go unpunished. I believe that it is long past due for us to demonstrate our resolve in dealing with terrorist elements. I have publicly supported the President's decision to attack the chemical weapons production facility in Khartoum and the terrorist training camps in Afghanistan. And I am reasonably assured that those strikes in Khartoum as well as Afghanistan were reasonable choices. And I can say that from being a member of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. The President deserves our support in taking those actions. Friends and foes alike must know that the United States stands united in facing down the scourge of international terrorism. And I am committed to providing the resources and the tools that are necessary to respond to the threat or threats of terrorism. And when acts of terrorism are committed, I'm committed to bringing swiftly these perpetrators to justice. More than 2 years after Congress enacted the most comprehensive anti-terrorism legislation in our history, however, it is appropriate for us to review whether our national counterterrorism policy is effective. In short, is the administration effectively using all of the tools at its disposal, including those provided by Congress, to disrupt foreign terrorist organizations, punish those nations supporting terrorists, and in cutting off funding to these various groups? Are these tools effective? Do we need additional legislation to address international terrorism? As the author of that bill, along with others on this committee, I'm very concerned about the answers to those questions. I must say that one aspect of the President's recent anti-terrorism policy does cause me some great concern. On May 22, 1998, the President issued Presidential Decision Directive PDD 62, which made numerous adjustments to the roles and functions of various executive branch departments and agencies relative to the prevention and deterrence of terrorist acts, the management of terrorist threats, and the investigation and management of the consequences of a successful terrorist act. It is my understanding that PDD 62 shifts responsibility for significant functions, including primary responsibility for federal counterterrorism special event security planning, preparation and implementation, from the FBI to other federal agencies, including the Secret Service. Although it has been suggested that PDD 62 only has each agency doing what it already does best, I believe that there remain questions about this directive. I am a supporter of the Secret Service and an admirer of Director Merletti, but I question whether the reassignment of responsibility for the counterterrorism mission is a wise step to take at this time. Additionally, I continue to have concerns that collectively we are not engaging in the kind of comprehensive, sustained effort against terrorism that is needed. In order to fight this war, we need to have an adequate assessment of the magnitude of the anticipated threat from the international terrorists to U.S. interests, persons, and property, both at home and abroad. We need to determine the composition of the major terrorist organizations and their leadership. Additionally, It is crucial that we maximize the development of information relating to their sources of financial and logistical support, the nature and scope of their human and technical infrastructure, the quality and type of their education and training, their level of advancement, and their linkages with state and non-state actors such as ethnic groups, religious communities, or criminal organizations, and their intent or capabilities to access and use weapons of mass destruction, which increasingly seems to be a matter of great concern. Without an adequate assessment of the threat, it is impossible to have a functioning strategy to counter that threat. Now, all of these questions deserve this committee's concerned attention. I want to commend especially Senator Cowell, who also serves with me on the Intelligence Committee, but who is chairman of the Subcommittee on Technology, Terrorism, and Government Information, for his focused and able work on this issue. He organized this hearing and should be commended for his leadership. We are pleased to have with us today 3 distinguished witnesses. On the first panel is the Director of the FBI, Louis Freeh. We welcome you here, and we appreciate the work that you're doing, the work you have done, the successes that you've had, and we're counting on you and your agency as lead people to protect Americans, not only at home but abroad. And I know you take that seriously, and you're doing a great job. On the second panel is former Director of Central Intelligence James Woolsey, and the former Ambassador to the United Nations, Dr. Jean Kirkpatrick, both of whom have had extensive experience in national security affairs. Mr. Woolsey held key posts during the negotiations of the U.S.-Soviet strategic arms reduction talks, nuclear and space arms talks, and conventional armed forces in Europe and SALT I. Dr. Kirkpatrick served for more than 4 years as our United States representative to the United Nations, as well as a member of the Cabinet and the National Security Council of Ronald Reagan, the first woman to ever serve in that office. She also served as president of as a member of the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board for 5 years and the Defense Policy Review Board for 8 years. Dr. Kirkpatrick, as we all know, has authored numerous books on public policy and is currently the professor of government at Georgetown University and senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. We are very happy to have all of these wonderful experts and servants of the people here with us today, and we feel very gratified to have them all here. And we welcome you all. We'll turn now to the ranking member, Senator Leahy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would also, at the appropriate place in the record, put in a statement by the senator from Wisconsin, Mr. Feingold. You know, the bombings of our embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, unfortunately, the most recent reminders of how vulnerable we are to terrorist attacks. And we know as a worldwide power, we are vulnerable. It might be an embassy one day, it could be a corporate headquarters that represents a very recognizable American company the next. But in a shockingly brutal attack, speaking of the 2 embassies, more than 250 men, women, and children were murdered in cold blood, 250. And among those 250 victims, of course, were 12 of our fellow citizens. And we have to mourn for them, and our hearts go out to their families and their loved ones here and abroad. And none of us, certainly here, can forget there's only a few weeks ago that there's an assault right here in the Capitol. And so we pay a terrible price for being the most powerful democracy in the world, because it does make us a prime target for those who disagree with our policies. But we want to keep the Capitol building and this Senate office building open to the public so that people can freely come in and see how we're doing the job they sent us here to do. And for the same reason, we have to keep our embassies open so that they can be examples of the freedom that the United States offers and not appear to be closed fortresses set in some kind of a hostile territory. The President responded to the terrorist bombing with a prompt, sharp blow against the terrorists and their facilities, as I believe he should. And the FBI responded with another prompt, sharp blow, the identification and arrest of persons suspected to be involved in the bombings. I hope we never start to take the truly outstanding work of our federal law enforcement agents for granted. Director Freeh, I must tell you I was overjoyed when you called me in Vermont to brief me on what had happened, to tell me that these terrorists were two arrests had been made, and they were coming back, because it is that kind of rapid response we need to do. And I hope you will pass on my warm congratulations and thanks to the agents in the field who broke that case, because as you discussed with me on the phone, this was not 9 to 5 work by any means. They worked around the clock and did an outstanding job. And it's taken time and effort to put in place. I think that a lot of it is due to the critical work of the legal attachés the FBI has in place around the world. They developed a kind of cop-to-cop relationships that help cut through red tape and bureaucracy. And sometimes red tape and bureaucracy can slow down in time of crises instead of speeding up, and that's when you need the quick reaction. The investigatory successes in this case show the legal attachés are helping to develop the cooperative relationships with law enforcement agencies abroad. It's that kind of relationship that we need if we're going to fight terrorism. And President Clinton acted precisely as an American president should act and must act. We have to protect and preserve American strength and credibility. We cannot tolerate the murder of American citizens or representatives of the United States government. We're not going to worry really today of an army marching against the United States. We're far too powerful. The threat we face is always going to be a well-organized, equipped, trained, motivated, and financed terrorist group. But that doesn't mean that we have to just stand there and let them hit at us. We can expect further acts of terror. We do remain a target. The witnesses today should be able to give us valuable information, what we can expect and how we can prepare. They can give us the benefit of their advice as to what the Congress can do to assist the President and the FBI and our armed forces in preparing for and responding to terrorism. We need to know whether our law enforcement and other agencies have the necessary resources to carry it out. This is not a fight of one day or 1 week or 1 year. 10 years ago, in May of 1988, as chairman of the then Judiciary Subcommittee on Technology and the Law, I convened hearings on high-tech terrorism, including terrorism with chemical and biological weapons and terrorist attacks on computer infrastructure. Mr. Woolsey was one of the witnesses then, and we were helped by his wise counsel then. I believe we'll be helped by it today. We made progress in those 10 years. We need to do more. To give one example, last year the Senate gave its advice and consent to ratification of the Chemical Weapons Convention, which had been initiated by President Reagan, negotiated by President Bush, and signed by President Clinton. And we passed implementing legislation which addressed complex technical and constitutional issues about which there was great potential for delay. We overcame that delay. The chairman and I joined forces on the floor. This bill was referred to this committee, I believe, on April 17th of 1997. We had hearings. We passed the Senate on May 23rd of 1997. Senators on both sides of the aisle joined on that. Unfortunately, the implementing legislation remains stalled in the House, and I wish that they would act as we acted. The House inaction is a very bad thing. There's very little time remaining in the session. They ought to do what we did here. They ought to have the same sense of urgency and determination, because the threat posed by terrorism and the means available to counter terrorists are technically sensitive subjects. They've got to be approached cautiously in this hearing, but I think the American people deserve to have the hearing you're having, and I congratulate you, Mr. Chairman. I congratulate Senator Kyle and those others who have worked together to put this hearing on.
Well, thank you, Senator. We're going to turn to the Director of the FBI now, and we look forward to hearing from you and whatever statement you care to make, and there will be no time constraints at all.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Senator Leahy, and all the members of this committee. Let me just begin by thanking you and the Congress for the support, really overwhelming support, certainly since I've been the director for the FBI, but particularly for the counterterrorism program. Senators Kyle and Senator Feinstein here and many others particularly charged with that responsibility of overseeing the operations, but also promptly and comprehensively supporting those things which need to be done to defend this country, not just within our borders, but now all over the world. I thought what I would do in a few minutes is sketch 3 areas of concern for us and certainly for the Congress and the country. One would be to discuss briefly the threat posed by international terrorists as it is appearing to us around the world and the different dimensions that it will begin to take. I'd also like to talk about the response to international terrorism, particularly from a law enforcement point of view. And third, I'd like to talk about some of the aspects of the government's counterterrorism efforts which could be improved and enhanced, which we have discussed before, but I'll put them in the context particularly of the other two subjects that I'll mention. The threat of international terrorism directed at American nationals and U.S. interests has followed a fairly identifiable pattern in several years past. Although the number of attacks against Americans overseas has decreased, the number of casualties has increased greatly, as has the scope and the targeting with respect to incidents that we detect and have been the victim of, where large-scale acts of destruction and terror with a clear objective to terrorize both the United States interests as well as the other national interests that support our efforts overseas. If we start with the World Trade Tower back in February of 1993, the Khobar attack in the summer of 1996, and of course the recent embassy bombings, which you've both mentioned, we see a escalated effort to attack larger targets with the intent to inflict maximum loss of life and, of course, the purposes of terrorist attack. I remember when I was sitting in court as a federal judge in Lower Manhattan in February of 1993 when we got word of the attack against the World Trade Center. In addition to the 6 people killed, hundreds of people injured, and millions of dollars of damage, we do recall that the intent of the people who perpetrated that attack was not just to create the explosion that occurred, but to actually topple one of the towers into the second tower with the clear intent, the admitted attempt to kill over 100,000 people. There was also an intent, not perfected, to include in that explosive mix chemical or biological agents, which would have had even a more permeating effect. 2 years later, we saw the sarin gas attack in the Tokyo subways, demonstrating the ability of a terrorist organization to conduct an act of terrorism, which included, in this case, the delivery of a highly lethal gas with the result of murdering 12 innocents, injuring thousands, and also putting up on the radar screen a new threat that is now something that we have particular concerns about, looking at some of the groups active today who have expressed an interest and who also betray a capability to use such weapons as part of an attack. The November 1997 attack on the foreign tourists in Luxor, Egypt, was conducted by an Egyptian terrorist group, but a group whose spiritual leader is Sheikh Rahman, who was convicted, as you know, in the New York case with respect to the plan to blow up the Lincoln Tunnel, the Empire State Building, and a plan that would have resulted in the murder of thousands of people. He was convicted in that case before he had the opportunity to conduct those operations, and that was the result of excellent work by many law enforcement agencies, particularly by the Joint Terrorism Task Force in New York City, which, as you know, comprises agents from multiple law enforcement agencies, including the New York Police Department. In fact, when I was visiting the East African countries recently, both Tanzania and Kenya, I saw at the crime scene several New York City police detectives who are members of that New York task force. These are particular experts with respect to vehicle identification. And to see New York City police detectives combing through debris looking to identify the vehicle, delivery vehicles in this case, was quite a statement about the level of cooperation and also the shared interest that these task forces regularly demonstrate. Secondly, let me talk a little bit more about the threat in terms of general types of origin. The first category would be state-sponsored terrorism. As you know, the United States government has declared Iran, Iraq, Syria, Sudan, Libya, Cuba, and North Korea as state sponsors of terrorism. These are countries where experience and fact has shown that terrorism is actually a tool of foreign policy. And the work of those countries with respect to this policy is evident in cases that have been charged, in many cases that are still being investigated. The second category of international terrorism includes the formalized terrorist organizations about which we know very much. These are generally autonomous organizations. They're transnational, both in membership and capability. They're able to carry out terrorist campaigns on an international basis. We know very well the Lebanese Hezbollah group, the Egyptian Al-Ghamat group, the Palestinian Hamas group, many other groups whose supporters, both inside and outside the United States, are able to engage in acts of terrorism. Hezbollah ranks among the most menacing of these groups, particularly with respect to its history of documented attacks against Americans. Both the 1983 truck bombing of the United States Embassy, as well as the 1985 attack on the U.S. Marine barracks in Lebanon, are two of the many incidents which we have documented and which still remain unsolved from a criminal justice point of view. The third category of international terrorism stems from the more loosely affiliated groups characterized by rogue terrorists or terrorists who have loose associations with formalized groups as well as other state sponsors. We saw that with Ramzi Youssef, who was convicted for not just the planning of the attack on the World Trade Center, but also for a plan to explode in one day 10 U.S. Aircraft over the Western Pacific, convicted for both of those offenses in New York. Bin Laden and his group, Al-Qaeda, which is a multinational group about which we'll talk a little bit later, these are more loosely affiliated organizations than some of the ones that we have traditionally seen active. They work together and combine with other organizations as well as members of other organizations on an ad hoc, case-by-case basis. This makes the identification of their infrastructure as well as their command and control much more difficult. And some of the regular methodologies that we use to surveil and penetrate these groups are impeded because of the looser affiliation and the more fluid nature of their operations. We believe that as attention focuses now for the moment on Osama bin Laden in the aftermath of the East African bombings, it is important to remember that individualized or rogue terrorists or people operating on an ad hoc basis are just one type of the threat that we sketched out for you here this morning. But there are many, many other capable individuals, groups, and associated groups who have that capability and that intent. With respect to the response by the United States as a government and by the FBI, particularly as an agency with respect to counterterrorism, the Congress has funded and supported, as I mentioned before, these efforts to an extraordinary degree. In 1995, for instance, we expended in the FBI approximately $118 million with 1,291 people dedicated to counterterrorism programs. Today, that figure is $286 million and 2,646 individuals. That has given us the capability to work crime scenes in East Africa simultaneously with all the other operations that are being conducted here in the United States. And again, I want to take the opportunity to thank this committee and particularly our other committees who have funded that operation and made it possible for us to react as we have recently. We also are not able to accurately gauge how many potential strikes or attacks have been averted because of our capability. We know from several sources that some terrorists have been discouraged from carrying out attacks within the United States because of their fear of the prompt response which they have seen, not just in the World Trade case, but in the Oklahoma bombing case and many other acts of domestic terrorism, where they are sure to see an overwhelming law enforcement response by the United States. We know of particular incidents that have been foiled, obviously, by hard work and counterterrorism preparation not just by the FBI, but many other law enforcement agencies working in conjunction with our intelligence agencies. 15 years ago, the President designated the FBI as the lead agency for countering terrorism in the United States. The FBI's counterterrorism program, as well as our responsibilities, have expanded both by virtue of the resources provided, but also the statutory authority and the various statutes that Congress has passed. For instance, it is now a crime to murder, assault, or take hostage overseas an American or to attack American interests. Since the mid-1980s, the FBI has investigated more than 350 of these extraterritorial cases. The two individuals who are charged in the East African bombings are charged under that statute, which is a fairly recent statute enacted by the Congress. Our investigation into the 1996 bombing of the Khobar Towers in Saudi Arabia, which killed 19 American servicemen, our investigation into the August 7th, 1998 bombings of the embassies, which killed 12 Americans and killed and wounded many others, are based on the legislative authority that this Congress has recently provided to the FBI. More recently, the Anti-Terrorism and Intelligence Authorization Acts and the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996 have broadened our ability to combat international terrorists. The threat of international terrorism demands continued vigilance, and Mr. Chairman, as you noted, a continued review of the authorities and the statutory powers and weapons that we have at our disposal to deal with this issue. We should be under no illusions that successes with respect to counterterrorism programs call for reprisals. And if you look at the history of counterterrorism successes as well as subsequent acts of terrorism, we know that there is a direct connection between the successes that we experience and the reprisal and reaction that we see from terrorists. That should not be a reason, could not be a reason to discourage aggressive action by the United States, whether in the law enforcement category or some other capacity. But we should be under no illusions that these successes, even the ones recently cited, clearly, in our view, will result in reaction and reprisal, and we need to be prepared to deal with that as a country and as a government. With respect to the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996, Section 302 authorizes the Secretary of State, as you know, to designate organizations as terrorist organizations. That gives us some powers and authority, together with the Department of the Treasury, to identify and seize assets of terrorist organizations within the United States. In a recent case, in July of 1998, we arrested an individual in Michigan, and we seized, together with the Customs Service, $124,000 in sensitive night vision and navigational devices. The individual was charged with material support to a foreign terrorist organization and the export of materials under the munitions control list. With respect to renditions, renditions is probably, from a law enforcement point of view, the most powerful weapon that we have to pursue our jurisdiction. Since 1987, we have done a total of 15 renditions from a variety of countries, individuals who were brought back to the United States to be charged. Since 1993, we've done 12 of those renditions. The other 3 were in the period between 1987 and 1991. So there's been a tremendous increase in the number of renditions. That has become a focal point of our policy. When I was in East Africa 2 weeks ago, I negotiated with the government there to return from Kenya the 2 individuals who were charged in the complaint in New York City. I believe that part of our success in getting custody of these individuals is based on a long record of successful renditions where the rights of the individuals involved as well as the sovereignty of the countries were respected, and we discussed that in our conversations in Nairobi. But this is an extremely effective weapon. Some of these renditions relate to cases that are 10, 15, 17 years old in one case. And it's critical that people who engage in acts of terrorism against the United States remember that at no time and no place will they be safe from our process, which is very powerful but also constrained by the limits of our constitutional system. The individuals who we interviewed in Nairobi, and in one case who made substantial admissions to us, were done strictly according to our criminal procedure. We gave them Miranda rights. We gave them all of the rights and opportunities that a subject would have here in the United States. And it's very important that from a law enforcement point of view, as we carry out our obligations, we strictly adhere to the rule of law. I think that gives us a credibility and the support that we will need from other countries to ask, which are in many cases difficult political acts for these governments in terms of renditing individuals who need to be brought back to the United States. One other aspect I want to just highlight briefly is the establishment of the Counter-Terrorism Center at the FBI, which was funded by the Congress and which is now operational. We have in that center representatives not only from 18 other federal agencies, including the intelligence community, but we have the ability for the first time to centralize in one analytical place a lot of the raw information that comes in, not just from around the country, but from our intelligence services, so we can plan and analyze and prepare for potential acts of terrorism, as well as to react swiftly when those occur. And that center is working very well. The interagency cooperation, I couldn't say more about that. You alluded to it in your opening remarks, Mr. Chairman, but the cooperation that we have received from the other law enforcement agencies, and particularly from the intelligence community, has really been exemplary. We would not have been able to operate successfully with respect to this particular case without the assistance of the intelligence community, particularly the CIA. The symmetry and the cooperation between the Bureau and the CIA in the counterterrorism area, as well as in other areas, but particularly in this area, is really at its height. I can't think of a better partnership in terms of discharging our mutual responsibilities. A lot of that has to do with the exchange of high-ranking FBI and CIA officers at our respective headquarters, the relationships that have developed between our legats and chiefs of station overseas. This is a relationship which protects the country and saves lives. And I just want to publicly thank Mr. Tenet and the CIA for their assistance. The State Department also, particularly the Diplomatic Security Service, has been outstandingly supportive, and again, a lot of the criminal case, which has developed successfully at a very quick pace, is responsible to their association. With respect to threat warnings, we have greatly increased in a very comprehensive way the ability to deliver threat warnings, not just to the law enforcement community, but to the state and local governments around the country. To American corporations, we have a system now where within minutes we can communicate with thousands of U.S. corporations to bring them up to date with respect to specific threats. And the online ability to communicate with our state and local partners to put out threat warnings in a rapid fashion has increased and is serving the country very well. Legats, again, Senator Leahy, you mentioned that, and I appreciate your attention to that. We are in desperate need of our legat situation overseas to perform our counterterrorism responsibilities. We have a total of 144 FBI personnel overseas. That's in 32 different countries. A very small percentage of the 28,000 FBI employees. But this deployment is critical to us, particularly in the area of counterterrorism. The East African bombings being a perfect example of that. Within several hours after the bombing, our legat from South Africa was on the scene in Nairobi, and our legat from Cairo was on the scene in Tanzania, organizing the crime scene. In the case of Tanzania, the legat got the Tanzanian army to create an outer perimeter to protect the crime scene. Those two offices, both in South Africa and Cairo, are new offices. They've only been open for about a year and a half each. And to deploy people from Rome or other places would have taken us hours. We would have lost precious time and opportunities. So the legat program, as we have established it, is working well, but we're also dependent upon it for a successful counterterrorism mission. We have approximately 32 legats now. We've asked in our 1998 and 1999 budgets for several additional offices, 20 more agents overseas in some key places where we know some of these groups that I alluded to before are active and are planning operations against the United States. But that program has worked very well. With respect to future needs, we certainly continue to enjoy the support that we've received on our counterterrorism programs. We are very concerned still, as this committee is, about the encryption situation, particularly as it relates to fighting crime and fighting terrorism. Not just bin Laden, but many other people who work against us in the area of terrorism are becoming sophisticated enough to equip themselves with encryption devices. We believe that a unrestricted proliferation of products without any kind of court access and law enforcement access will harm us and make the fight against terrorism much more difficult. So we appreciate the attention and the support of this committee, particularly some of the members who have worked very, very hard to focus attention on this area so we don't disturb the leadership of American technology in this area, but we also make sure that we have an ability to protect people in a technology that grows every day. In the area of weapons of mass destruction, we have increased our ability to deal with those issues, both by equipment, by training, by resources that are dedicated to that, both in our laboratory as well as operational units, both at FBI headquarters in the field. If you take Yosef's statement with respect to the trade tower, you look at the Tokyo subway incident, and you look at some of the statements that even bin Laden has made with respect to chemical and biological weapons, this is a new feature with respect to terrorism that gives us immense concern and an immediate need to continue to prepare for attacks in this area, both in terms of prevention, but also in terms of our ability to react to them swiftly and to have the capability as a government, not just as a law enforcement agency, to prepare for that. We're in the process now of a training protocol which will reach approximately 120 cities over the next year and a half to train their first responders, police and fire, to deal with this issue. But from a law enforcement point of view and from a counterterrorism point of view, this is an area of great concern. We've seen the use here in the United States of ricin, of easy ability to fabricate sarin, the threats with respect to anthrax, most of which have been false alarms, are necessarily critical for us to prepare for and to have the ability to deal with, both from prevention and reaction. I alluded briefly to the Joint Terrorism Task Forces. We have 16 of them now around the United States. We've asked for a few more in the 1999 budget. These are very critical operational task forces. They include not just FBI agents, many other federal agents, and always state and local police officers and detectives. They give us an ability that we could never enjoy as an agency operating alone. I wanted to say just a few words about the East African bombings. I'm limited, of course, because the case is now moved to a criminal prosecution. There are two individuals, as you know, who have been charged in separate complaints in the Southern District of New York, and I have to be very circumspect in what I can say with respect to the case. It is a very fast-moving and very wide-ranging investigation. There were a total of 471 FBI personnel between the two crime scenes in East Africa at the height of the deployment. Their work, both in those countries and in the countries which have become relevant to that investigation, both in terms of support, leads, and investigation, 13 other countries who have assisted us in that endeavor. We are working very hard with some initial success in identifying the individuals responsible for that. We have a lot of work to do. We've completed most of the forensic examinations at the two crime scenes. There is still much to do, both with respect to the individuals who have been charged and any other individuals who may become part of that prosecution. Having gone to those crime scenes and spent time not just with my own investigators, but the police officers from Kenya and Tanzania speaking to the government officials in both places, it is absolutely critical that we enjoy the support and the confidence of the countries where these crimes occur. This was a crime both against Americans and against Kenyans and the people of Tanzania, who were victimized even to a greater extent than the United States. We need very much the support and cooperation of our law enforcement colleagues around the world to do these cases. We could not operate, we couldn't even get off the plane in both places without the support and cooperation of the police forces. And as I said last week, and I expressed it to the highest levels of the governments of both countries, their cooperation was just outstanding. I can't think of a more exemplary time in dealing with foreign countries where we've had the cooperation that we've enjoyed and continue to enjoy there. And that's very, very important for us in order to persevere. Again, I want to thank the committee for its attention to these matters, always its support, and I'd be happy to try to answer some of your questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Director. I have a meeting with the majority leader, so I'm going to turn the committee over to our chairman of the subcommittee on terrorism. But just a couple of real quick questions, and then I'll turn it over to him for his question. We'll have 5-minute question periods. Without compromising classified information, can you give people in America approximately how many known terrorists and terrorist organizations we have within our country?
I think if you...
or would you rather not say?
If you define the organization broadly, I think, you would be certainly in the category of, 20 to 25 major organizations, and then many other loosely affiliated groups.
What about known terrorists?
We have, as you know, active investigations on many individuals in the United States who are suspected of acts of terrorism or being agents of foreign powers or organizations who perform acts of terrorism. It's a very vital part and an active part of our counterterrorism.
It's a significant number, though, is my point.
Yes.
And then one last question. How many, as I understand it, Osama bin Laden has some members of his organization even in this country, as well as many, many other countries.
We've identified people in the United States or people who have transited the United States who are associated with him.
And he's also setting up terrorist cells and terrorist organizations and financing terrorist organizations and activities. And can you give us a roundabout ballpark figure of how many countries?
He is active through his followers in various different dimensions in several dozen countries.
Well, I have a lot of other questions, but I'm going to count on, if I can turn it over to Senator Kyl at this point. And then the list that I have is Senator Kyl, on the Republican side, Senator Kyl, Sessions, Thompson, Abraham, DeWine, and Specter, and on the Democrat side, Leahy, Feinstein, Durbin, and Biden, in that order to call on. And I just want to personally thank you for the efforts you've made, especially in these recent matters, but in a lot of unknown private matters that I personally know about, where you've protected American citizens not only domestically but abroad. And the FBI doesn't get nearly the credit it deserves, naturally, because you can't talk about it, a lot of these things. But I want to certainly compliment you for what you've done and the leadership you provided. And I also want to thank Mr. Woolsey and Dr. Kirkpatrick as well for the efforts they make in these areas and for being here today as well. So I'll turn this over to, yeah, I'll put my questions in the rest of my questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Free, you stated in your testimony that disrupting the ability of terrorist organizations to fund their destructive activities is a critical tool for law enforcement, and of course we all agree with that. I've introduced some money laundering legislation, S2011, with the Department's support to facilitate the seizure of criminal assets. Just so I could lay out for members here what it does, it would allow immediate seizure of assets of persons arrested abroad. It would improve access to records in bank secrecy jurisdictions. It would add crimes committed abroad, such as crimes of violence, bribery of foreign officials, smuggling weapons, to the list of money laundering predicates. It would ease admissibility of foreign business records, and it would provide for fugitive disentitlement so the criminals fleeing U.S. prosecution would be unable to use American courts to fight seizure of their criminal assets. Would these kind of provisions be useful in crippling either a bin Laden organization or similar terrorist groups?
Yes, sir. They'd be very instrumental.
Is this one of the big problems we have, being able to get their money?
It's one of the biggest problems we have, and of course, they don't usually keep the money in their own name or keep it in one place for any period of time. So those are additional tools and resources that would be very relevant to these particular types of transactions.
One of the things that prompted me on it is the awareness of how easy it is to buy any kinds of weapons, major weapons, explosives, and so on, if you have the money. And also the ease to be able to store things or to even set up training facilities again if you've got the funding. You've referred to encryption, and you and I have had a number of discussions on encryption, probably have more, but at a hearing earlier this year before the Subcommittee on Technology, Terrorism, and Government Information, a former colleague of ours, Senator Sam Nunn, talked about the need for breaking the deadlock on encryption, which he says is, quote, absolutely essential for infrastructure protection as well as for any kind of commercial activities which are beginning to emerge in the world of the Internet. He also said, quote, I do not think that we can limit the power of encryption successfully over the long term. That's like trying to limit technology. I do not think it can be done. Do you disagree with Senator Nunn and think instead the FBI's efforts to limit strong encryption without key recovery mechanisms can be done?
You know, I agree with him, and we've never really tried to limit strong encryption. In fact, we advocate the strongest American-made encryption that's possible. Our only interest in the technology is having the ability, with a court order in our hand, to get access to plain text at some point that doesn't affect the level, the strength, or the robustness of the encryption. So we are strong proponents of encryption. In fact, it has a great public safety interest in it that we support.
My concern, though, on encryption, we still cannot seem to get either laws or the policies together in this country. We have those who are involved with encryption and software companies, the people who use it for corporate means in moving material back and forth, whether it's financial material or designs or anything else back and forth across the world, and law enforcement and the administration and export controls and everything. Everybody seems to be going at different purposes. I've hosted so many meetings I lost count between law enforcement and everybody else. I also think about how we put together the Leahy Edwards' law on digital telephony, the wiretap law. We did that when we finally brought everybody together. I would just urge again that we try to find some way to do that in encryption, or we're going to find that it's going to be a moot point because all the encryption will be done by the Europeans or the Asians. Senator Nunn recommended a Council of High Technology People, an advisory committee to the law enforcement community, if for no other reason so they could start communicating with each other. I don't know, maybe such a council might be helpful. Do you have any feelings?
It would be very helpful. We talked about this recently. Senator Kyle and Senator Feinstein had 7 of the major CEOs with respect to the industry, and we talked about a technical support center, the contribution of their corporate resources to efforts which would begin to solve some of these problems. So we have some things that I think are moving in the right direction. I do agree with you. We do have to act on this fairly quickly, and we have to protect our commercial interests because our economic security is important. But just as important is our national public safety, which is the law enforcement part of this. And, you know, it's not, in my view, something that can't be done. It's just going to require, as it has, a lot more hard work.
And lastly, you and I talked about the legats abroad and how we use them in both in the Tanzania and the Kenya bombings. Did we find in this exercise that there were problems or things that we could improve or things we should be doing differently?
Our communications systems really need to be improved. When I was in Nairobi to talk to my special agent in charge in Dar es Salaam, I had a call back through Washington. We couldn't get direct lines there. That's one of the many logistical problems. Part of the other infrastructure is just our ability to get the funding required to put agents in a particular place. We have now, as you know, agents in places like Riyadh and Cairo, Tel Aviv, Islamabad. We didn't have them there a few years ago. That has given us a tremendous capability, and we want to preserve that.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Leahy.
And again, I applaud you for your work. I know you've done a great deal of work in putting these hearings together.
Well, thank you. And much of the legislation you talked about is legislation that you began some time ago. So this is a joint effort, certainly a bipartisan effort. Director Free, there are several things I'd like to get into, but first of all, let me give you an opportunity, if you would like to avail yourself of it, to take a minute to indicate what efforts you have undertaken to at least ensure that any law enforcement capability that's necessary to bring to the tragedy of the Swiss Air disaster last evening has been brought to bear. Is there anything you'd like to comment on with respect to that?
We have been in close contact this morning with our colleagues in the RCMP as well as the Canadian Intelligence Services. We have certainly some great interest in the passenger manifest, which we're examining now, in the other aspects of the American part of this that need to be preserved, the fuel mixtures. A lot of things are being done at the airport to secure what could be evidence or information that's required to make decisions. We don't have any indication at this point what caused that tragedy. We're hopeful in the next couple of hours to be getting additional information from our colleagues in Canada.
Thank you very much. I think it's at least reassuring that you have the people in place and can act quickly to at least preserve anything that needs to be preserved so that we can always know the cause of tragedies such as this, and obviously if there's something amiss to be able to take appropriate action. I think everyone has spoken appropriately of the good job that the FBI and associated agencies did in getting our agents and material to the 2 embassy bombing sites and in working with local authorities to help crack those cases. My understanding from you is that it's the largest deployment of U.S. law enforcement in investigative history. At the same time, I know that there were a lot of logistical problems that arose. For example, I understand that there were some weight restriction problems on some aircraft, too much equipment to fly safely, apparently mechanical failures of 2 aircraft in the very first deployment, and some other delays. You have mentioned the great importance of having legates in the region, in Egypt and South Africa. What other kinds of changes do you think we need to make, Congress working with the administration, with law enforcement, perhaps the Defense Department and others, to ensure that we learn lessons from this experience and next time the operations can go even more smoothly?
We have learned a lot of things, Senator, and as you pointed out, there were some logistical problems, none of which were insurmountable, and I don't think any of which resulted in the loss of evidence or certainly the loss of lives, but we did experience issues. 3 of the 4 aircraft that took either the FBI crime scene personnel or the FEST teams, those are the Rapid Advanced Deployment Teams, 3 of the 4 aircraft had mechanical issues that had to be resolved. When we did get on the scene, obviously, communications issues, these are our own problems, and just the logistical movement of so many resources to support 471 people. We've taken that experience and we've been working with the Defense Department, who did, by the way, an outstanding job, because at the same time they were moving investigators, they were moving wounded and other Marines into the area for security. So they did a magnificent job. But we would like to have, and we've discussed this with them, and I think we'll work it out, some dedicated aircraft that could be used just for the law enforcement deployment. We have 4 or 5 deployment teams pre-identified in different disembarkation locations around the United States, so we would put these teams overseas very quickly, but we need to ensure the aircraft. And then there's another logistical problem when it comes to moving subjects. Some countries, as you know, will not permit us to land with a subject in a case of this nature. So we need certain aircraft to bypass countries, and that requires, again, logistical planning, and we're in the midst of doing that.
Fine. If there are specific recommendations that Congress needs to react to, get those to us. I'm sure we'll all be anxious to act on those. You spoke of additional tools. Senator Leahy and you spoke about encryption, and let me just note that I appreciate your mention of the meeting that Senator Feinstein hosted with 7 of the CEOs, yourself, the Attorney General, and others. And I would just note that I thought from that there were a lot of good ideas. The question is whether there is the political will on the part of all parties to sit down, relax, and begin working with each other, as opposed to trying to press their own point of view on that. But from your point of view, I want to commend you for being willing to talk to anybody, anytime, to try to find a way to deal with the encryption policy, and I commend you for that. Let me ask you about, there's a supplemental appropriation that may be sent up by the administration. Is there anything in there that you need or that we should be aware of from the FBI's perspective that we should be looking for?
Our main focus on that has been, the transportation aspects, both the aircraft necessary to move teams simultaneously to different parts of the world. We'd like to be able to put a team any place in the world within 24 hours. It took our teams about 48 hours to get to each location. It was good, but we could do better than that, and we can do better with that with some dedicated aircraft. We need a fast aircraft to move subjects and move advanced insertion teams. We need some communications equipment and maybe some enhancement in our laboratory and forensic ability. But we're confident that when we put it together, it's not going to be anything except what we absolutely need, and we're forecasting the necessity to deploy, as we did 4 weeks ago, maybe to 1 or 2 locations at the same time, and that will strain our resources unless we have some dedicated assets.
And in next year's appropriation budget, we will probably see some requests for more funding for more agents to be deployed in other parts of the world too. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. A final question. I have thought that perhaps one thing we might do is amend the law with respect to the reward that can be offered for the rendition of terrorists. I think there's a $2 million limit today. And I know that that isn't always the answer, but in some cases it has in fact worked, and I just wonder what your reaction to that is.
I think it's a positive step. It certainly would be an indication to people who might otherwise not want to be in that position to assist. I think it's certainly a positive step.
Okay, thank you. Let me call on Senator Feinstein. At the same time, again, commend her for her co-leadership of the Technology and Terrorism Subcommittee, and specifically her leadership in trying to bring people together to resolve the encryption issue. Senator Feinstein?
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me just follow up Director Freeh just for a moment, since I watched CNN into the wee hours last night on the terrible tragedy that took place. Is it true that the airplane was cleared to land at Logan in Boston, but for some reason did not?
Senator, I heard that report too, and I asked the question this morning. Have not gotten an answer back, so I don't know. As soon as I have that, I'll get back to you.
Thank you very much. I wanted to concentrate my time on two issues. The first is counterterrorism, and the second is the encryption issue, which Senator Kyle and I have worked on together. With respect to counterterrorism, I am very supportive of a robust, deep, wide, and well-funded counterterrorism effort with advanced deployment wherever the FBI and others feel it's necessary. I would be hopeful that in the supplemental you would not hold back on whatever the needs are to develop this kind of counterterrorism effort. I'm also aware of the fact that we have strong laws in place that prohibit the assassination of foreign leaders. How do those laws relate to non-foreign leaders, but people who are well identified as terrorists, non-state actors? What is present law with respect to their takedown?
With respect to foreign leaders, I think the executive order is clear. I'd have to really go back and study it. I've not done that analysis, and I don't know whether any of the lawyers in the department have done so. The question is whether a non-state leader, non-governmental organizational leader would be part of that prohibition. I don't know the answer to that. I think it would require a legal analysis of the order itself.
Are you prepared then, and I've read your written text of your statement, to see that you have all of the equipment, the intelligence, the military help, whatever is necessary to really put together this robust counter-terrorist effort?
Yes, yes. I mean, I've communicated that to the OMB, which is formulating the supplemental, and I've not seen the final result of that. And if there's something that I think we need that's not in there, I'll come back and tell you.
Because I would hope you'd let the subcommittee, through our chairman, know if there is anything that we can be helpful with. Let me for a moment turn to the subject that was mentioned, which is the encryption. And you know, clearly I think the terrorist attacks against the United States citizens really heighten your concern that commercial encryption products will be misused for terrorist purposes. And I understand that law enforcement is attempting to enhance its technological capability to respond to the use of strong encryption for criminal purposes. I wanted to follow up on some of the questions that have been asked. What does the FBI require to enhance that capability? You mentioned earlier access with a court order to plain text, but to be able to crack strong encryption in a timely enough way.
Senator, what we need is a capability which is also a transparent capability, one that we can talk about and prove up in court when we have to show what the ones and zeros mean in plain text. We have to have a protocol and a methodology that's subject to disclosure and proof. That means we can't use any of the means or methods that an intelligence service might use. What we have asked for and what the Congress authorized in the 1996 Death Penalty Act is a technical center. In other words, a law enforcement technical center, which would be supported by DOD as well as other agencies and the private sector, but would give us the in-house court deliverable abilities to not only decrypt, but then to prove up the plain text in a legally admissible way. We are asking in our current budgets and future budget requests for the authority to put that technical center on the ground, staff it, and have it up and working. So that's probably the key part of what we need from a technology point of view. And if you remember from our meeting, that was exactly what the CEOs responded to, in the sense that if we can't solve 100% of our problems, which we may not be able to do in this area, we'll begin solving a couple of them, and particularly collaborating on some of the technical aspects.
Well, I know your people are having informal meetings with a number of the companies, and I think that's extraordinarily helpful. With respect to this sort of TechNet Center, how soon do you think it can be adequately up and running?
We have funding now to do an A&E study, which is going to occur in the next year, and the funding and construction and technical assembly of all the equipment we would need would probably have to be done over the period of the next 2 years, and that's what's been outlined in the budget requests. But as soon as we get that up, the better off we're going to be.
And that, if I understand it, would provide you with the rapid access with a court order to plain text.
Yeah, would certainly promote that. The other thing that we need is we probably need some legislation that would allow the companies who want to contribute resources to do that, to receive those resources from private individuals. We will need some legislation, and our people are working, I think, with this committee on that.
I think we'd be very interested in helping you in any way we can develop that. And if I might say, because I've thought a little bit about the meeting since we've had it, and that may really offer the best opportunity to solve the problem without having to get into sensitive issues like key recovery.
Mm-hmm.
And at least I hold out the hope that it will. Do you tend to agree with that?
I agree with you 100%, Senator, and I think, as Senator Kyle said, having that meeting and organizing it as you did was a very key factor. We're working with the industries represented at that meeting. In fact, one of the CEOs sent a suggestion to us for a technical solution that we hadn't really contemplated. So some very good developments have come from that one meeting itself.
Good. I'm very glad to hear that. And congratulations on the arrests. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Sessions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate very much your particular interest over a period of years in this particular subject and your leadership on it. Director Free, first I'd like to say how much I respect you. I first came to see your work when you personally prosecuted, as a federal prosecutor, the Moody bombing case involving the murder of Judge Vance, and coordinated a most complex and broad-scale case. I think it showed your skill in terroristic-type activities. Also appreciate your leadership to the FBI. You have displayed the fidelity to duty and courage that's characteristic of that organization. I am proud that you're there. I appreciate your independence and integrity. And I mean that most sincerely, and it's important for our nation that we have you where you are.
Thank you.
It seems to me that we are indeed troubled by terrorism, but our nation is a great nation. And I suppose it's going to be inevitable throughout our lifetime that we'll be troubled by these type activities. And we need to be smart, prepared, disciplined, and tough in dealing with it. But at the same time, we certainly don't need to be panicky and uncertain in our response. Let me ask you this. There were some reports in the press that you were not consulted in advance about the attacks on Afghanistan and the Sudan. Is that correct, and would you comment on that?
No, I was consulted in advance.
Were you asked for an opinion, and did you express an opinion on the wisdom of those two events?
I was consulted on it, and together with the Attorney General, we gave our perspective. We gave certainly our law enforcement perspective, but we were not decision makers, nor were we asked to make a recommendation one way or the other.
Who was a decision-making body for that decision?
President was the individual who decided the action that was taken. I think he had a very small group of senior government officials at the cabinet level who were part of that process. I don't actually know who they all were, but I was not one of them.
And were you asked for your opinion and recommendation?
No, sir.
Did you offer it?
I offered a law enforcement perspective with respect to the matter that we were confined to, which was the investigation and whether or not at a certain point in time we had evidence against people who we could then charge with this offense. And we discussed it from a law enforcement point of view.
Was the FBI able to contribute any information that was beneficial to the analysis of this situation?
I think so. We've had an investigation of bin Laden and his organization for several years, a lot of evidence, a lot of intelligence, which we have analyzed together, and we did provide that for them.
With regard to that particular organization, was there any other organization more knowledgeable about it than the FBI?
The CIA also has had a dedicated project with respect to this organization for several years. We collaborate on that effort, but it is a separate effort in the sense that we're looking at the law enforcement aspect of it, and they're looking at the total collection effort. But
did you concur in this decision or express reservations about this decision?
well, again, I gave a law enforcement perspective, and the questions did not go to my opinion or my recommendation, and I did not offer them.
Would you evaluate for us some of the issues that you thought were important in making that decision?
Well, again, you know, there's different aspects to it. My concern and the question was whether, from a evidentiary point of view, at the point in time when the question was asked whether we had enough evidence to charge an individual or a group of individuals or an organization with the two bombings. And I gave a response to that based on the evidence as it was developed at that point.
Seems to me in a case like this, I've supervised a lot of investigations, as I know you have, in which you've penetrated a criminal enterprise, and you have to make decisions about when is best to make the arrest and take the organization down. Did you express any reservations about whether this was the appropriate time to, in effect, expose the knowledge we had of this organization?
You know, I guess to put it into perspective, it's not inconsistent to have a national security self-defense plan working contemporaneously and in a non-contradictory fashion with a law enforcement plan. The questions which I were asked were very narrow, and the questions were whether we had enough evidence to charge a group of people with a particular crime. I gave a response to that. With respect to the impact that that action would have on law enforcement action, we discussed that too, and we gave our opinion with respect to that. But we were not asked to make a recommendation, nor were we part of that decision-making.
Well, with regard to that, it seems to me that your opinion as to whether or not you could utilize more time to and exploit the intelligence information that you had to know more and establish more proof about this organization would be very important. Did you give that, and did you express concern about moving quickly as was done in this case?
You know, again, I sketched out where our investigation was, what we needed to accomplish in the immediate time frame as well as the long-range time frame, and certainly expressed what I thought was pertinent to other countries who could be affected by the action and how that could relate to the law enforcement efforts. But the law enforcement efforts are a very small and compartmentalized piece of it. And
I recognize that's just one part of it, but would you say that it has complicated your ability to further investigate the case?
No, I don't think so. I don't think that's the case. We have gotten, since those events of August 20th, the 2 individuals back from Kenya. We have a number of other individuals in various countries who we are interested in speaking to and which may result in additional charges. the countries relevant to those individuals have been cooperative, so I don't see any negative impact with respect to that.
Well, it's a very delicate thing when you make those decisions, and I hope that we made the right one. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Sessions. Senator Durbin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Free, thanks for being here today, and thank you for the good job you're doing. A little over a week ago, my wife and I were on vacation in Ireland, and it was our first visit, and we were struck by many things. And probably the first impression was the impact of the Omagh bombing, the terrorist activity there, on the people of Ireland and Northern Ireland. I understand the President will be visiting that village this afternoon. It's interesting to me that not only did the Irish seem to rally around this event, unlike many of the other acts of terrorism in recent memory, but also that the governments of Ireland and of Great Britain have suggested some changes in their law to deal with terrorism in their country. I don't know if you've had an opportunity to read about these proposed changes, but several of them relate to the rights of individuals who are accused of terrorist activities, their rights to remain silent, whether their silence can be used against them when it comes to their cooperation with terrorist organizations, and the involvement of others in selling guns and explosive devices to those who might use them for terrorist purposes. Have you had an opportunity to review any of these suggested changes, and do you have an opinion as to whether or not they have any applicability to our own concerns about terrorism in the United States?
No, Senator, I haven't reviewed them. I'm aware of them in the generalized manner that you've described them. But, you know, with respect to their relevance or what the importance would be in terms of that situation is really not an assessment we would be in a position to make.
Your testimony seems to suggest that you feel the current state of the law in terms of death penalty and your investigative practices are adequate at this time to deal with what you consider to be the terrorism threat in this country. Is that correct?
I think that's correct. I mean, we could certainly, and this committee is aware of certain areas which we could address. For instance, we could make crimes of terrorism part of the racketeering statute. We could authorize the interception of communications for certain terrorism-related offenses which are not currently in the Title 18 authorities. We could get authority to do pen registers and trap and trace orders with respect to foreign intelligence and international terrorism investigations. We could get access to records of common carriers, public accommodation facilities, physical storage facilities for use in international terrorism cases. There's a whole series of things we can do, and I think we are working to do. But in general, we have certainly enough authorities to perform our counterterrorism function.
Could you inform and educate me as to the standards which your agents use when they are involved in renditions? When you are overseas in the midst of an investigation, as you were in Africa, do you continue to apply and insist on, in this case, the standards required by American law in terms of constitutional protections, even for foreign nationals?
Yes, we do. First of all the action that our agents take have to be consistent with our Constitution and our rules and regulations, including our internal rules and regulations. What we did in this particular case was ensure that what we were doing was consistent with our Constitution, but also with Kenyan law, because our Supreme Court has said that if we request a foreign police service or government to acquire evidence and they use methods which are inconsistent with our due process, we can't use that evidence in our court. So we were very careful and are always careful with respect to renditions to make sure we're operating under legal authority.
You've also made reference to the Cobar Tires incident, which involved the loss of life. I have read, and I want to give you an opportunity to respond, that the Saudis have not been cooperative to the extent that we would like them to be in terms of investigating this matter and bringing to justice those who might be responsible. What has been the level of cooperation by the Saudi government as well as any other governmental entity that might be involved in this incident?
Well, the cooperation has been mixed with respect to some aspects of the investigation. We've had absolutely 100% cooperation for instance, are working on the crime scenes in Saudi Arabia. The Saudi Arabian police forces identified for us an individual who was subsequently arrested in Canada, brought back to the United States. We have not received all of the information that we've requested and access to witnesses. Under their law, under their Sharia law, their process, as they explained it to us, is not amenable to the sharing of information, particularly with respect to witnesses charged and in custody, and we've been trying to work these things out for several months. So it's different, obviously, from what we've seen in the two countries that I mentioned, but it's also a different system of law, and we have to continue to press for opportunities to get what we need.
Can you be more specific? In what specific areas have the Saudis refused to provide cooperation or information that might lead to a successful investigation as the cause of that bombing?
Well, we've asked for access to certain witnesses, people that they've questioned, and we've still not received that.
How long has this request been pending?
From early on in the investigation.
Well, it strikes me as very unsettling that a country which we have dealt with so closely for so many years is an area of lack of cooperation, has shown a lack of cooperation in something as basic as investigating the loss of American life. Has there been any exploration of the freezing of assets involving this incident?
We have a great need to complete our investigation of the Khobar bombing, which does involve access to witnesses and information that we have not heretofore gotten. My judgment is the best way to do that is to continue to work, as we have very aggressively, with our counterparts and also on the political levels, to find a legal means acceptable to their system of justice that would give us the information that we need. I've not recommended or really even contemplated any other means. This is a very strong ally of the United States. Their police force has been of tremendous assistance to the FBI in not just this case, but many other cases, including a recent case where the Mubahith, which is my counterpart in Saudi Arabia, arrested and interdicted a group of terrorists who were intending to attack Americans. So we depend very much on that cooperation. We do get good cooperation. There are some areas of this case where we've not gotten what we want, but we have to work out between the two sovereignties a means to get that.
I think it is because of the strength and history of this alliance and the fact that we have literally risked American lives to preserve the integrity of Saudi Arabia in the Persian Gulf that it is all the more troubling to hear your testimony about those breakdowns in cooperation. I applaud those areas where we are making progress with the Saudis, but when it comes to an area as sensitive as the loss of American lives in this Khobar Tower bombing, I find it unacceptable and unforgivable that they have not come forward to be more helpful. I hope my colleagues on a bipartisan basis will join me in trying to find ways to encourage the Saudis to move very quickly to complete this investigation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Durbin. Senator Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Mr. Free. I want to ask you to give us a little bit better assessment, if you can, as to what we may be in for as a country, as far as terrorist activities is concerned. I know this necessarily must be imprecise, but in light of recent activities, we've been told that bin Laden, for example, has declared war upon us. And I've certainly got the indications that we've declared war on him. And we have, and perhaps others like him. Those are strong words. We've heard here today how extensive his network is, his operations are, how many countries he may be in, some countries that may be on our terrorist nation list and some that may not. That he has people here in the United States. It seems to me that it is important, if in fact that we are in for the long haul and that we have this kind of problem, that we as a people assess as best we can the seriousness of the problem. If it is very serious, if we are going to be in or expecting more of these kinds of attacks, both domestically and with regard to our embassies abroad and our other targets abroad. We need to know that. The American people need to get ready for that, and they need to be convinced that we need to do the things necessary to confront that. Is it being overblown, or are we in fact going to be in for a succession of these things in the future, in your opinion?
I think we can predict with some certainty that we will see a reaction by bin Laden and his organization with respect to the law enforcement as well as the national security action that the United States has taken. This is an organization of great resources, as I mentioned, active in many countries. It is a unique organization in the sense that you have a multinational following. You have individuals literally all over the world who are followers of bin Laden. If you remember, one of the individuals who was charged and executed by the Saudis for the OPM Sang bombing, that was the bombing in November of 1995, 4 Americans were killed in Saudi Arabia, said that he was a follower of bin Laden. We know that many, many people have been trained in the camps which he funds and supports, including Yosef, including many of the other individuals that we are concerned about. So I think there should be no illusions about the fact that when bin Laden, going back to August 22nd of 1996, repeated in May of 1997 in a CNN interview, in February 23rd of this year, and as recently as May of this year declares war on Americans and issues a fatwa to kill American civilians anywhere they may be found, is about as serious and imminent a threat as I can imagine. So I think that...
So we talk in terms of his retaliating, but the fact of the matter is he was apparently planning on a series of activities against us, whether or not we did anything.
That's right. Had we taken no action at all in this case, we would still be subject to his targeting.
But you do think that there will be a retaliation specifically from our latest activities in Afghanistan and Sudan?
I think we can expect that.
Just from his organization alone you're talking about. And of course, he's only one organization.
Yes.
So can you, on a little broader scale, can you give us a better sense of your estimate over the next few years in terms of the level of activity? We've had from time to time terrorist activities for some time now. Can we expect an increased level of activity, do you think? Is there any reason to believe there might be?
There is reason to believe that the increased activity in terms of larger targets with more fatalities being the objective of those attacks is clearly the pattern that we've been seeing for the last couple of years with respect to this organization and several others that are aligned with him. He has very strong alliances with the 2 major terrorist organizations in Egypt, for instance, with other terrorist organizations.
Is there any indication of any alliances with or dealings with, communications with any of these terrorist nations that you've described?
There are some indications of that, but I would prefer to do that in an executive session.
All right. Well, I appreciate that. I think that we need to further explore that because it certainly seems to me that we're in for something that we're not ready for as a people. We don't fully understand the nature of the threat, and that needs to be gone into. One other group, the extent to which front groups present a problem. You mentioned the fact that there are front groups here, or terrorist groups here that are operating, I assume, mostly as front groups. I know in the '96 Terrorist Act, we attempted to do something as far as their fundraising activities are concerned, that the Secretary of State would provide a list that would not allow them to raise money and send it abroad. Of course, by the fact that they're front groups, it indicates that there's some, at least, ostensible, legitimate activity going on. To what extent are these groups a problem? What special difficulties do you have in encountering them, and have we seen any indication of the Terrorist Act of '96 having any effect on that?
The act has resulted in 30 of these groups being declared under the statute, terrorist organizations. In some cases, including the one I mentioned in my opening statement, we have seized monies and moved to criminally charge people involved in material support of these designated organizations. A lot of the affiliated members and groups in the United States do not engage in violent criminal activity or even planned activity. A lot of the activity here has to do with fundraising, infrastructure building, even acquisition of technology issues. A lot of the groups that we've identified are not actively planning, nor do they have plans, we think, to attack American targets. But the act is a very...
They just raise money for those who do attack American targets.
Sure. The act has given the government the ability to seize some resources, but again, they don't keep their resources where they're easily found, and they move them very quickly. So it's one of many things that are necessary.
Senator Biden.
Thank you. Welcome, Judge, Director, Louis. Isn't it amazing what a difference a year makes? I'm glad to see that just proves in this town, if you hang around long enough, they'll figure out how good you are. And congratulations. People are finally figuring out what a good job you're doing. I remember a year and a half ago, wasn't quite the same position. So just keep your head down and keep doing what you're doing. You're doing a hell of a job. This town's amazing. At any rate, and I'd make another point here. I would think we should clarify from the beginning, and you tell me if I'm wrong. We should stop talking about retaliation and talk about continuation. These plans that bin Laden had laid out, many of which you've intercepted, some of which have been thwarted, were plans that were sitting there on the table before the President of the United States ordered a strike. They're there. We thought they were going to occur. Some did occur. We assumed they were going to continue. And so I really think it's a very important point to make to the American people. This is about continuation, not retaliation. Because if we let it slip into this notion of retaliation, it implies that if we do not respond, then they'll stop. And that is there any evidence to suggest that had we not retaliate in Afghanistan or anywhere else in the world, that bin Laden would have said, you know, they didn't get mad at me for blowing up those 2 embassies, so I'm now stopping.
No, the evidence is to the contrary. In his interview on May 26th of this year, which was from his headquarters in Khost, which was one of the areas targeted, he said that the jihad against the Americans, which was a result of the fatwa, which he had signed in February with leaders of 2 other organizations, quote, would be known in the next few weeks. So this is, as you point out,
with all due respect,
continued plan.
You don't need advice from me, but I hope you and everyone else drops the word they're going to retaliate against us and talks about a continuation of their stated goal. Because when you say anything else, you get Americans walking up to each of us in our cities saying, well, mate, are you sure? Should we really do that? I want to say it again. This is a continuation. If and when another attack occurs, and as sure as I'm sitting here, there will be another one. Somewhere, somehow, terrorism all of a sudden is going to be evaporated from the world here. It will not be because of what we, quote, did. It'll because it is part of the long-term strategy and agenda of bin Laden, as well as others who we should talk about in another context. My time is going to run out quickly. I met yesterday, my staff, for a couple hours with State Department people. We in the Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Helms and I, are about to hold hearings on embassy security. What do you need? What do the embassies need? You make a major impact on that. Your recommendations impact on that. The Inman report is being looked at again, and as the Admiral indicated, it should be looked at again to see what needs to be done. And so we're going to hopefully have a serious supplemental, an emergency supplemental here to deal with that problem. I would respectfully suggest that while everyone is aware of and knows the job you're doing, now's the time to ask for what you want. Ask now. Ask now. Just as this town has an incredible memory, this place has very short memory. and we get diverted very quickly. And I want to go to the 96 Terrorist Acts, which I'm the author of. You gave me advice on how to write it, and they kicked out a lot of our colleagues decided a lot of the things you thought you needed were not relevant. For example, we added a number of additional crimes that fall within Title 18 as federal crimes relating to wrecking of trains, terrorist acts abroad, terrorist acts transcending boundaries. And we said for the first time these are now federal laws. But because some of my friends were so caught up in the Minutemen and remember this was in the context of those wackos in Montana who were out there, whatever their names were, they call themselves, and all this Minutemen and militiamen malarkey. We had all of a sudden this crescendo coming from the right saying, no, 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 we can't go that far. Now, the very crimes we made federal laws, you don't have the authority to use wiretap on. We made them a federal crime. But what everybody forgets, except the people on this committee, is there's two requirements for you to get a wiretap. You have to have probable cause, but beyond that, whatever the crime has to be listed in the federal code, and then it also has to be listed in the wiretap section of the federal code. Now, you don't have time, I don't have time to ask you to answer the question now, but I'd like for the record for you to go back and say whether or not we should reinstate many of those provisions that were dropped in the 96 law. And the last thing I'd like to ask you to do for the record, or if you have time today, is to tell us whether or not the question asked by Senator Feinstein warrants our attention. I would very much like, with the permission of the chairman, a legal memorandum from the FBI stating whether or not the prohibition against assassination of heads of states applies to organized crime units and or terrorist units that are not in any way. And I'd like a legal judgment. Now, maybe I'll have to ask the Justice Department for that, but to the extent that you can do that, I would find that personally very helpful. Let me close by saying I think there's a lot of hope here. I just got back from an 8-day trip, long meetings with Mubarak, meetings with Arafat, meetings with Bibi Netanyahu, meetings with Arafat's security people, and so on. They're starting to figure it out. Ben Laden, for example, is a greater threat to Arafat's life than he probably is to the President of the United States. Ben Laden is a greater threat to to Mubarak's life than he probably is to Bibi Netanyahu's. These guys are starting to figure it out. They're starting to get it right. And I make a prediction to you, you're going to get a whole hell of a lot more cooperation from quarters, and you're already getting some, from quarters that we would, in the past, assume to be hostile to our interests because they figured out, whether it's the Hashemite kingdom or the House of Saud or the president of Egypt or the head of the PLO, that they are on their targets. Hamas, for example, would just as be happy to get rid of Arafat as it would be to get rid of somebody in the Israeli government. And so I think you're going to find more cooperation. I found some hope, not because they're good guys, not because all of a sudden they've seen the Lord, but because they've seen the light. And the light is they're at the other end of that night scope too. And so I hope the progress you've been making was able to be continued. You're doing a heck of a job. They talk about you, by the way. I'm serious about the good job you're doing over there, not just here. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Senator.
Thank you. And if I could just follow up, I think two of the suggestions or comments that Senator Biden made here are very, very important. First, his request that you revisit the question of what ought to be put back into future legislation with respect to authority or tools that the FBI needs. I think that's a very good suggestion. And secondly, our subcommittee on technology terrorism had a hearing, I believe it was February 26th, in which the fatwa was first, of Osama bin Laden was first made public. And I think it's an excellent point. We've had their threats out there for a long time, and it may be retaliation in one sense, but in another sense it's the continuation of a war, and I think that's a point that needs to be made over and over.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
Yeah. Senator Specter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Freeh, I would like to pursue the question about terrorist problems with chemical and biological warfare within territorial United States. On Tuesday of this week, the Veterans Affairs Committee released a staff report
which showed the inadequacy of the Department of Defense in protecting military personnel, focusing first on the Gulf War and on Camisea in March of 1991, where nerve gas was disseminated. Tough question as to what has caused Gulf War illness, but that report gets into a long list of chemical and biological agents which are deadly. That report makes the book, The Cobra Event, look like small potatoes. I was surprised to find out that the number of these deadly substances is classified. Can't even talk about how many there are. And the number where we have a response, an antidote or a serum, is also classified. And even a smaller number of the serums have been approved by the FDA, so that what we really have is not only a Department of Defense which is unguarded, but an America which is unguarded. A reference was made earlier to anthrax, and there's an inoculation program being undertaken by the Department of Defense, except that there's only one source of supply for anthrax, a Michigan outfit, and that plant is now shut down, won't reopen until 1999, and the number of inoculations needed are 6 per person. And the President earlier this year said that there ought to be a source of supply of anthrax for the civilian population, which is a subject that ought to be addressed by perhaps the Department of Health and Human Services. And the question is, what is the risk internally to the United States, our population, for chemical and biological attacks, and what level of preparedness do we have on such attacks?
Senator, I think it's probably accurate to say that the possibility or the probability of such an attack within the United States is fairly low right now, but the impact of any such attack, even a small attack, we had the anthrax incident in Las Vegas, we had one here in Washington. The impact of one small incident is so grave and the loss of life could be so extreme that it's an odd juxtaposition of a low probability with a very devastating impact. So I think we have to look at the problem as one that is probably more imminently within our experience than otherwise.
Director Free, are you saying that there is no evidence known to the FBI of any plans for a chemical or biological attack on the civilian population in the United States?
Yes. We have incidents, the ones that I've discussed. We've also had cases with individuals who were making and trying to use ricin. For instance, we had a prosecution recently in the Midwest with respect to that. But with respect to any plan or operational indication that somebody is going to carry out such an attack in the United States, we do not have that. That does not mean, excuse me, that it's something that doesn't deserve, as it does deserve, our most immediate attention.
The issue of retaliation is always one in the forefront of our minds when we take a look at the bombing of the German discotheque by the Libyans and our going after the Libyans in 1986 and then Pan Am in 103. What do you assess the risk factor of retaliation from our missile attacks on Afghanistan and the Sudan?
Well, again, with respect to bin Laden, his plan and his experience and his capability against Americans has been ongoing and intensifying since early 1996. So I think his plans and his targeting is probably unaffected by the reaction on August 20th, but certainly...
You think whatever he was going to do was bad and he's going to do it anyway?
Well, by his own pronouncements, killing Americans everywhere did not, certainly at that time, have anything to do with anything we were doing. So I think his plan is clearly clear.
Well, I would think we would be well advised to prepare for an acceleration of whatever plans he has. My yellow light is on. I want to pick up on what Senator Durbin said about Khobar Towers. And I believe it is infuriating that we have 5,000 men and women in Tent City in the middle of the desert protecting the Saudis and what we have done to defend the Saudis, and their refusal to let us question the suspects they have in custody over Khobar Towers. And this is a subject you and I have discussed on many occasions, and I compliment you for the work that you have done in going to Saudi Arabia and your efforts with the Saudis. And we know the history that just less than a month prior to the June 25th attack on Khobar Towers, the Saudis executed 4 individuals who were involved in a car bombing, I believe in Riyadh the previous November. And the FBI couldn't question those as suspects either. And I'm interested to hear you talk today about Saudi cooperation on some other matters. And I know it is very, very difficult, but I think the situation is intolerable. I think you've done an outstanding job, as I've said publicly, on many occasions in the past, but I don't know quite the level of disagreement with the Saudis this morning about Khobar Towers. And I think we have to find a way to get more from the Saudis, or find a way to become independent of their oil and take out our troops and let them defend themselves, which wouldn't last very long. And I appreciate the fact that that's not a viable alternative today, but in some way we have to turn up the heat and have the FBI ask those questions and make a determination as to whether Iran is involved or what the unpleasant consequences may be, so that we can figure out what to do.
We are dedicated, and I am personally committed to doing that. I had, as you know, because we spoke about it, I had the families of the 19 slain airmen down actually to the FBI Academy for 2 days we spent with them. And their question, which is a very simple but very powerful question, is what are you going to do, and when are you going to solve this case and bring the people to justice, or at least charge the people who were involved? I could not be more committed to doing that. You yourself have talked to the highest representatives of the government. Many other senators have done that. I want to keep those lines of communication open, but I also, as I have in my meetings and my letters and other meetings we're going to have later this month with some Saudi officials, repeat our request, and we will persist in our request. We will not be satisfied until we get that information.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Specter. I want to commend both you and Senator Durbin for bringing this matter up at the hearing. I've spoken with the director about it. And I think another thing we could do to be helpful on this, frankly, is to communicate our strong sense of commitment to this to the President, the Vice President, Secretary of State, all of the other key administration officials. Obviously, we can't expect the FBI itself to do this when there are key administration officials who are also involved in dealing with the Saudi government in a variety of different ways, and maybe our strong expression to the administration of a willingness to cooperate and help to pursue that would be another thing we could do. And you've taken leadership in that. Perhaps that's something else you'd want to pursue. May I ask one more question, Director Free? Senator Feinstein asked me to ask you, the FBI needs some $85 million to build and fund the technological support center that you discussed before. It is her understanding that this will not be in the administration's supplemental funding request. First of all, is that true? And secondly, if so, will it be in next year's budget, fiscal year 99 budget request, to your knowledge?
Senator, it's not in the supplemental. As I understand it, it is included in our 2000 request. And as I mentioned, we have identified some funding to do the architectural and engineering work, which will be done in the next year out of already available funds. But we are under our own urgency to get this done.
All right. Thank you very much. Do any of the senators have any other questions of Director Free? Yes, Senator Sessions.
Did you understand that bin Laden was supposed to be at the Afghanistan camp when the a missile attack occurred? I've not heard that stated publicly.
I'd be happy to discuss that with you if we could maybe right after the hearing, if you have a moment. Thank you.
Thank you. If there are no other questions of Director Free, let me just say that I think it was important this morning for you to appear publicly to describe to the American people the latest information that you can discuss with respect to the embassy bombings in Africa, what the FBI has done in that regard, and importantly to paint the picture that you have about this ongoing threat of terrorism, the sophistication of the terrorists, the amount of money that they have available, their use of technology like encryption, the fact that they're working on the most deadly kinds of weapons of mass destruction, and that in fact their emphasis seems to have changed to killing many more people in the incidents of terrorism that they seek to sponsor. It's important that this base be established in the discussion of the kind of strategy that the Congress and the administration need to pursue. And since that's the subject of our next panel, I think it's a good lead-in. But I want to personally thank you, Director Free, for providing that information to us. And again, you will have the continuing cooperation of this entire committee, I know, in the requests that you make to help us in fighting terrorism. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and both to you and Senator Feinstein for having the hearing. We appreciate it very much.
Thank you. Well, let me call the next panel Jim Woolsey and Dr. Kirkpatrick. Can you stick with me for a little bit? For those in the audience and the panelists, I apologize for running right through the lunch hour, but it is the only way we'll complete this important program this morning. Senator Hatch has already provided the formal introduction of our two panelists here, but let me just say that I very much appreciate both of them being available really to answer the key questions that we have based upon the foundation that Director Free has just laid. Former CIA Director Jim Woolsey is experienced in dealing with the information that is gathered about the terrorists and, of course, has worked closely with the FBI. So in some senses, we have the two sides of our intelligence coin and law enforcement in dealing with terrorists in his representation here. And Ambassador Kirkpatrick, Dr. Gene Kirkpatrick, who was formerly the ambassador to the United Nations, a member of the Reagan cabinet, and also on the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, brings another key element of expertise that Senator Thompson alluded to, the necessity of having a strategy in the United States that can deal effectively with countries all over the world in gaining their cooperation to deal with terrorists, something which is critical to an effective United States strategy. So in some senses, we have really two wonderful experts here to discuss these matters. Let me just provide about a 1-minute introduction to this part of the hearing. It is unfortunate that sometimes our policy with respect to terrorism seems reactive. It isn't that way. There's a great deal of action always taking place that the American people are not privy to, but when there is an embassy bombing and so on, there seems to be a reaction to it by the United States, such as that action that was taken against targets in Afghanistan and Sudan, and also the desire to harden our embassies. But as we know, it's impossible to turn our embassies into fortresses, and that in any event, supporting a greater intelligence effort has benefits beyond just specific targets like airliners or embassies or military installations or whatever the particular target might be, because a greater intelligence component enables you to deal with the challenges to all of those particular targets. And therefore, U.S. intelligence spending is a critical element. And one of the things that I'd certainly like to talk to Director Woolsey, I guess I could just call you Jim Woolsey at this point, about former director of the CIA, is the state of the intelligence budget, the fact that it's been on steady decline for 8 years, and the necessity of ensuring that we have adequate funding for our intelligence needs. And the second aspect, equally important, is the need for a consistent and effective strategy, not just a policy. A policy is something, we're all against terrorism, that's a policy. What we need is a strategy as a country, a plan of action that we consistently administer. And that, I know, is something that Jean Kirkpatrick wants to share with us. In this respect, I think it's important for us to note on the record at this hearing the fact that the chemical weapons facility in Khartoum, which was struck, which bin Laden's organization apparently owned or had significant ties to, probably drew its technical expertise from Iraq in its development of lethal chemical agents. And as long as Saddam Hussein, which provides this expertise, is able to face down UN inspection teams and sees the United States as weak and vacillating in dealing with him, I see no evidence that he's going to discontinue his activities just because he wants to become a good guy, that he will, as a result, continue to produce weapons of mass destruction and continue to threaten his neighbors and continue to provide that kind of expertise to others who would do it as well. And I think that the administration, frankly, owes the American people an accounting for the disparity, or at least the apparent disparity, between the public representations of policy as a policy of firmness and the contradictory reports from others, Scott Ritter being one, that suggest a policy of appeasement when dealing with the problem is really hard, and that's the case of Saddam Hussein. So with that introduction expressing my views, let me welcome both of the panelists here. And I don't know if you've decided between you which one to start first, but perhaps Ambassador Kirkpatrick, you would be willing to make the first statement. Then we'll turn to Director Woolsey and then begin the questioning.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Senator Kyle. And thank you all for holding this important discussion and this important hearing. And I'm going to say that I personally feel that I profited from the testimony of Director Free. And I thank you for inviting me. And I'd like to say that I'd like to be relatively brief in my remarks. I feel that there are just a few aspects of this subject about which I have any special knowledge or insight. And then insofar as I have, it derives either from my life study as a political scientist, looking at the evolution of various kinds of states and dangers of dangerous states, and in the United Nations, where I had a very intensive cram course, as well as the PIFIAD, President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. That's about it, though. I haven't. And I feel that what I would like to emphasize one thing that we all know, but I just want to emphasize it. And it is that we've seen the rise of fanatical, violent, extremist groups in the last 2 decades, really principally since the seizure of Iran by the Ayatollah Khomeini and his followers after the collapse of the previous regime there. And we are watching now not just the proliferation of chemical and biological weapons, but and nuclear knowledge and technology and missile knowledge and technology. We are watching the proliferation of violent, murderous, cosmopolitan, as it were, groups of, and even states, which can serve as a base of this variant of Islamicist terror. This, I want to be very clear that I am not in any way suggesting that persons who practice the Muslim religion are exponents of terrorism. Within it, as I was on some of the trips that Senator Biden took part in, to which he just referred. And on that trip, I was doing some sightseeing in Jordan, in Amman, outside Amman, looking at some extraordinarily interesting Greco-Roman structures, which were the most impressive I've ever seen, about better than Greece or Rome. And it was the dusk was falling, and a relatively young Arab fellow and two of them, and a wife apparently and a child, approached me and said they thought they recognized me, and could I confirm it? And I said I didn't know what, it depended on, was I who they thought they were? Who they thought I was. And I said it depended on who they thought I was, We did this for a couple of times. This young man, he lives a good deal of the time in the United States, he told me. And he also said that he's back visiting his relatives in his hometown, and he said that in his hometown was widely believed that, and asserted continuously, that Americans have declared war on Muslim peoples. And I said to him that I was very shocked to hear this, because what I heard was that some terrorist groups associated with the Islamists, violent extremist Islamists, had declared war on the United States, and that this was assuredly what had happened in the case of Osama bin Laden. And I reminded him that President Clinton, whom I am not given to quoting as a reference, had emphasized in his statement after the attack, our bombing in Afghanistan and Sudan of those bin Laden facilities, specifically that the United States was not, in any sense, at war with Muslim peoples, states. And I reminded him that several Muslim populations and states were themselves principal targets of these extreme fanatical Islamicist groups and countries. Egypt, for example, and the government of Egypt is a prime target. Jordan itself, where we were, is a prime target. Moderate Arab governments are prime targets. Jordan was the object of 5 terrorist attacks last year, in 1997, within a relatively brief period. That government is anathema to the terrorist extremist groups. But I want to emphasize that these groups, while some of them are not state-sponsored formally, or not formally representative of a state, they are greatly empowered when political actors friendly to, supportive to the terrorist groups gain power in the state. I think we can see very clearly in Afghanistan that the government of Afghanistan today, the Taliban, which has said it would go to all lengths to protect Osama bin Laden in their territory from arrest or harm, providing that they had, unless they had adequate proof and evidence that he was not guilty of anything he was charged with. One has the sense that the Taliban leadership is not likely to see adequate evidence to convict bin Laden, because they themselves are fanatical extremists and enormously repressive and arbitrary in their rule. We see the danger today of the spread of this kind of government to Pakistan, which is deeply disturbing. We read this week about the proposals to extend Islamic law, the Sharia, which an extreme form of Islamic law, to Pakistan. Now, when a government and the resources of a government fall to the purveyors and practitioners of really extreme and political doctrines and human doctrines, totalitarian doctrines, which these are, they strengthen the forces of those groups, of bin Laden, for example, all over the world. When the Sudan becomes a state available to bin Laden for the pursuit of his goals. Afghanistan becomes a base for the training and preparation of his terrorist troops, if you will. It is very desirable for us to take all possible, reasonable, appropriate steps to prevent governments from falling to the hands of extreme violent terrorist groups. When we think about the period between the World Wars I and II, we can remember that there was a decade when things looked as if they might, or nearly a decade, a few years anyway, when it looked as if the whole world was getting better and democracy was in fact spreading, and some 3 violent terrorist groups managed to seize the power of government in 3 major European capitals. First, of course, the Bolsheviks, who seized power in Moscow. They were unknown, unheard of, they were unimportant until they seized the power of government. The Bolsheviks seized the power of government of Russia. Mussolini and fascists, his black-shirt fascists, seized the power of the government of Italy. And then, of course, that very weird fellow, Adolf Hitler, and his band of brown shirts seized the power of Weimar Republic and the government of Germany. And they used those governments as the base then to make war on Europe, and then ultimately to plunge the world into war and to kill many millions of people. So I would just like to suggest and emphasize today that the fight against our counter-terrorism policy needs to begin with an effort, a serious effort, concerted effort, to contain violent terrorist groups, before they manage to establish themselves in control of governments. Today, I think Pakistan represents a major challenge. It would be a dangerous tragedy for the Pakistani people and for for Americans, and so people who want to live in peace and freedom around the world, if the government of Pakistan were, in fact, to fall to violent extremists. That's my number 1 point. And I think it would put all of much larger areas of South Asia at risk, were that to happen. The fact that Pakistan is now the possessor of some sort of nuclear capacity, it makes it all the more undesirable that this should happen. We have seen already the use that Islam, bin Laden can make of Sudan. I think we need to pay very close attention to the regime in Sudan, not just to bin Laden, but to the government of Sudan, because the government of Sudan is like a source of infection and also a protector of infection, which lends its strength in Africa and beyond to others who are purveying terror and violence. So, of course, we know does Iraq. Iraq was, of course, for many years the protector and provider for Abu Nidal. He seems to have left there for some reason. Apparently he's ill. But we know that Iraq has supported any number of other Palestinian terrorist groups and other terrorist groups who operate in the area and outside the area, who attack Americans. PFLP, for example, one period was harbored by Iraq. I think that problem will not be dealt with, in my judgment, as long as Saddam Hussein controls Iraq. And the Sudan problem will not be dealt with as long as that government of Sudan provides support and supplies and sanctuary for terrorist associates. So we really must look at the struggle, I think, at this earlier level. I would like also to say that I was very pleased that the administration President undertook the attacks in Afghanistan and Sudan, the chemical facility, and the training bases that he did. I think it was an important step, and I think it was particularly important that he simply undertook that responsibility as President of the United States, fulfilling some aspect of his duty as an American president, and that he didn't propose simply to take it to the Security Council. And we have all heard, I have certainly, perhaps even more because I was out of the country, complaints against the United States unilateral action against the bin Laden bases and chemical facility. I would just like to say that I believe that no other kind of action except action which the United States takes leadership when Americans are attacked would adequately respond to the terrorist who is targeting Americans. I would remind the committee, what I think you doubtless all know in any case, that the actions of the Security Council, United Nations Security Council, its processes are cumbersome, and its actions are slow, and there are represented in the Security Council, as in the General Assembly of the United Nations, generally all UN bodies, virtually all the governments in the world, including those who supply and give sanctuary to terrorist states. And we have not persuaded them that because they're in a UN context, they should act to support law and punish lawbreakers. Quite the contrary. Neither should we imagine, as someone suggested today, that by signing the Chemical Weapons Convention, we will have dealt with the problems of proliferation of chemical weapons, or that we can count on the machinery for the enforcement of the Chemical Weapons Convention to help control the chemical products which might be converted into weapons by terrorist groups. It doesn't work that way. The fact is, of course, that some people imagine that we would have ended nuclear proliferation by persuading all the governments in the world to sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT. And those people forget that the government of Iraq, quite specifically, sat on the governing board of the IAEA and signed the treaty, of course, and sat on the board the entire time that they have been working as hard as possible to promote, to develop their own nuclear capacity. And moreover, that we know that the machinery of the IAEA itself and the processes which guarantee the provision, help to non-nuclear countries in providing for peaceful uses of nuclear energy for peaceful uses, has in several cases, almost surely including Iraq and North Korea, assisted them in the development of their own nuclear capacity, as it is today, in fact, assisting Cuba, I believe, in the development of a nuclear capacity. So this kind of easy answer to a very difficult question won't work, answers nothing. And I think that it is well that we are facing the fact that when Americans are targeted, the American government needs to respond. I think I'll just say one more word maybe, and one more quick point, and it is that I don't believe that I'd like to specifically reject this suggestion of some pundits and politicians that the reason that the United States is particularly targeted by some terrorist groups, particularly some of the Islamist terrorist groups, is that we are tended to support Israel in a variety of areas. I feel certain that is not true. I feel certain that the reason we are targeted is that we are everything that they dislike and are at war against. We are an open society, a modern society, a secular society, and a peaceable society, and a free one. And we are examples of the success of open, democratic, pluralist societies. And this is what they would like to eliminate. They have a different view of the kind of life and kind of government that is desirable. They really are advocates of a kind of thoroughgoing totalitarian approach to life and society that would put even the Soviets, make the Soviets look like moderates, in fact. Not to speak of the fact that they keep all, unlike the Soviets, would put all women into veils and keep them inside. And Perda, that's going a good deal further than the Soviets ever went. They represent, proponents of a very extreme, fanatical, terribly anti-modern, anti-democratic, anti-West, anti-scientific life. And that is the reason that they particularly object to us. I think I'll just stop, if I may. And
thank you, Ambassador Patrick. Those are very insightful comments. I specifically want to get back to the first point you made in the questioning period. It's a very interesting element of the counterterrorism strategy that I think is somewhat ignored. But
I think so.
It's evident when we hear you say it, and we realize it's so critical.
May I put a question?
Oh, yes, certainly.
I don't want to answer now, but I would like to end my testimony with a question, if I may. And my question is whether it is true that bin Laden was the architect of the attack in Somalia, the ambush in Somalia on American troops that killed 18 and wounded some 70. I've read this several times in recent days, and I think the committee should be concerned with it.
Thank you. My recollection is that the President himself alluded to that incident in the 4 points that he raised at the time he explained the action that we were taking in Afghanistan and Sudan. We can double check that, but I think that's correct.
I was out of the country, and all right, thank you.
I believe that's correct. Director Woolsey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll just speak to 3 points, if I might, with respect to intelligence and terrorism. First, certain aspects of collection of intelligence that are unique to terrorism. Secondly, providing intelligence to the President on this issue. And thirdly, actions that the country should consider with respect to what it learns. As far as collection is concerned, most intelligence collection relevant to terrorism is going to be human collection. This is dangerous work and costly. For example, one needs to use non-official cover officers to recruit spies inside terrorist organizations. Not too many of Mr. bin Laden's supporters and friends attend embassy cocktail parties. Occasionally one gets something useful from photo reconnaissance or communications intercepts, but generally this is a business of espionage, and it's dangerous espionage, and of intelligence liaison work with foreign intelligence services. Our work with foreign intelligence services is absolutely crucial here. Often we have cordial, even close, intelligence relationships with a country, even when our foreign relations, our formal relations, are cool. And the key nation here is Pakistan. It is very difficult to maintain even good intelligence relations in secret if formal relations deteriorate past a certain point. And although Pakistan has been a friend and ally of the United States off and on for many years, relations have deteriorated since the end of the Afghan war. The Pakistanis felt they were singled out by the Pressler Amendment. For example, they paid several $100 million for F-16s. We kept the F-16s and the money
One can rationalize that as much as one wants with respect to confusion and policies in the U.S. government, but from Pakistan's point of view, it was a terrible situation, still is. Pakistan's central quarrel with its main rival, India, is over Kashmir. The reason is because the population of Kashmir is largely Muslim, would almost certainly vote to be part of Pakistan in a plebiscite if that occurs. That's the reason India does not permit a plebiscite, because they know they would lose. And Pakistan is, I think, quite resentful about that issue. It is hanging in the balance now in many ways, as Ambassador Kirkpatrick pointed out. And in these circumstances, there are few issues that are more important with respect to dealing with terrorism based in Afghanistan, in that part of the world, than the ability to cooperate closely with Pakistani intelligence and law enforcement. This may involve obtaining information. It may extend from time to time even to joint operations to capture and bring terrorists here to the United States. Yet, in these circumstances, at least as reported in the New York Times, 2 of the 4 camps that we hit near Khost in Afghanistan with the cruise missiles were Pakistani-supported camps to train people to fight in Kashmir. Now, it depends on whether you're an Indian or a Pakistani, whether Pakistanis fighting in Kashmir are terrorists or freedom fighters. But nonetheless, I would submit that we do not have a dog in that fight, and that with respect to sending a message, making a point, fighting terrorism, if that is in fact the case, as reported in the New York Times, at least those 2 particular camps might not have been the wisest selection for targets, insofar as close relations with Pakistan are absolutely at the heart of our ability to fight terrorism and even learn about terrorism in this part of the world. Third point I want to make with respect to collection of intelligence is that after I left the Director of Central Intelligence job, some guidelines were put in place out at the CIA for intelligence collection. They derived from the controversy surrounding Mr. Bamako's death and Jennifer Harbury and then Congressman, now Senator Torricelli's interest in the matter. And the result was some guidelines which do not bar, I want to be clear about that, but they do to some extent deter intelligence officers from recruiting as assets people of less than savory backgrounds. Now, when one is trying to recruit a spy inside a foreign government, one frequently is able to take advantage of the fact, as I used to put it, that Thomas Jefferson still does a fair amount of recruiting for us. Indeed, maybe half of the Russians who died as a result of Rick Ames's treachery were good people, Democrats, patriotic Russians who hated communism, who wanted to work for the United States for that reason, not people who were working principally for money or even for money at all. But when one is recruiting spies inside terrorist organizations or inside organized crime groups, it's normally a matter of cash on the barrelhead, or inside, with respect to law enforcement, often giving personal freedom to some very unsavory people. The U.S. Department of Justice, for example, freed Sammy the Bull Gravano for testifying against John Gotti. Sammy the Bull confessed to 19 murders. He may be today your or my next-door neighbor without our knowing about it. But that trade was assumed to be a reasonable trade in order to accomplish a greater good, to convict John Gotti. By the same token, if one is going to recruit effective spies inside terrorist organizations, one is going to have to pay money and otherwise deal with some rather ugly people. Now, there are circumstances in which if there have been American victims of these individuals, one needs to report that to the Justice Department. There are violations of American law that must be avoided. But as a general proposition, we should not be operating under guidelines that deter at all our case officers' ability to recruit informants, spies inside terrorist organizations based upon those terrorists' past behavior. Second major point I want to make has to do with providing intelligence to the President on this issue. I was, in the early 1970s, for 3 years here in the Senate General Counsel of the Senate Armed Services Committee for the late Senator Stennis. And whenever I would tell him that I didn't know as much about an issue as another member of the staff, his response was always, well, let's get him in here with us. There is no substitute for the top man or woman making a decision and having at hand, face-to-face for dialogue, the people who really know the substantive issue that needs to be dealt with. The New York Times yesterday, I believe, listed the people who were advising the President on these strikes. The DCI's name was omitted. I very much hope that that was a typo or an oversight by the New York Times. But it is, I think, extremely important that there be a dialogue back and forth between the President and not only the DCI, but senior technically informed people in the intelligence community on some of these very sensitive issues when decisions of this sort are being made. Now, I believe that the intelligence community was correct with respect to its analysis of the soil sample, and I can go into that in questioning if the committee is interested, and that VX was in some fashion present at the facility that was struck in the Sudan. But some of the early statements about the exact nature of Mr. bin Laden's relationship to that facility and whether or not there was any other manufacturing going on, pharmaceuticals and the like, those statements from U.S. government, senior U.S. government officials turned out to be in error. I understand, and this is not from the United States government, that the tie to Mr. bin Laden here is that he provided in the early 1990s some $8 million to the military-industrial corporation, I guess you would call it, that's the overall management of these types of facilities in Sudan, and that the owner of the plant in question, Mr. Idris, is a protege of a Mr. Hafuz, the chairman of the National Commercial Bank of Saudi Arabia. Mr. Hafuz's sister is married, I understand, to Mr. bin Laden. So there were some ties to Mr. bin Laden, financial and otherwise. But some of those original statements by senior U.S. government officials turned out to be in error. And this might suggest that a more thorough understanding of all of the details about each of these targets would have been far preferable to any last-minute decision-making. My own experience is that the President reads carefully, indeed is a speed reader and reads voluminously what is sent to him on matters of this sort, but at least in my 2 years there, did not frequently engage in face-to-face back and forth with even the DCI, much less the senior members, other members of the intelligence community on these sorts of issues, other than the DCI's attendance at formal National Security Council meetings. This is important. The intelligence community is not like PEPCO. It is not a utility that supplies something useful to the White House. The President of the United States needs to spend time dealing with and understanding exactly who knows what and asking questions when decisions of this sort are being made. I decided after 2 years as DCI that the country deserved someone in that position who had a better personal relationship than I was able to establish with the President. And I sincerely hope that the situation is better today. But I must say that the signs, direct and indirect, of excluding intelligence from meetings and the last-minute nature of decision-making in this matter suggest to me that at least some of my experiences in my 2 years may not have been idiosyncratic. Finally, Mr. Chairman, actions that we might take with respect to intelligence. Intelligence is much useful assistant to law enforcement in making possible the renditions that Director Free spoke about, and that is yet another case in which cooperation between, for example, Pakistani and American intelligence and law enforcement is crucial. The intelligence community can also be engaged pursuant to formal findings signed by the President, covert action to make life difficult or worse for terrorists. Certainly, assassinations are barred, not only of senior government officials or heads of state, but are barred, period, by President Ford's executive order. So we are not talking about those. But money, for example, freezing or otherwise dealing with the resources and assets of someone such as Mr. bin Laden or his associates could be the most important way to deal with many aspects of terrorism. I understand that Mr. bin Laden is probably involved with a number of other wealthy individuals, some connected with banks in the Mideast. This committee knows, I believe, that banks in that part of the world have essentially no audit and no oversight, and a great deal of flexibility is permitted them, as the BCCI scandal indicated. We may well be talking, in short here, not about just Mr. bin Laden's several hundred millions of dollars being put at the service of undertakings of this sort, but billions, or even in one estimate mentioned to me, tens of billions. Of course, the source of this directly and indirectly is the world's dependence on the Mideast for its oil supply. The Persian Gulf and the Caspian Basin probably have about 3/4 of the world's oil, and even at today's prices, that produces a substantial flow of resources. I'm afraid some rather interestingly large share of them may be being used for purposes that this committee is concerned about. Another aspect of covert action is working with governments in the area. Again, I would call to mind Pakistan, in raids and other operations against terrorists, possibly to bring them to justice, or possibly other types of operations against them, such as to deport them to other countries, has recently occurred, I believe, in Albania. And covert action can also be used, and I won't say anything more than this in open session, to give governments incentives to dry up support for terrorist groups. The final type of action we might take based on intelligence is military action, such as the 4 strikes against the coast camps and the one into Sudan. I believe that the strike against Mr. bin Laden's camp was entirely justified and entirely appropriate. But terror is generally not a real estate intensive operation. Shooting cruise missiles at buildings is not, on the whole, the best way to deal with it. It is different if there is something in the real estate that is almost irreplaceable, such as the Osiris reactor that the Israelis bravely destroyed at the beginning of the 1980s, thereby saving the world for perhaps 2 decades from Saddam's nuclear program. I believe with Ambassador Kirkpatrick that normally when military action is taken, only unilateral action is likely to be able to be quick or effective. There may be circumstances in which state sponsorship is clear and action against a state is important. On the other hand, with respect to Sudan and Afghanistan, we may not have state sponsorship of Mr. bin Laden so much as Mr. bin Laden's sponsorship of those 2 states, where terrorists are extremely wealthy and countries are extremely poor. The countries themselves, to some extent, are victims rather than managers. With respect to military retaliation, the Chinese have a bitter saying, but one that has some wisdom in it, that revenge is a dish best eaten cold. Sometimes what is important with respect to military retaliation is not that it be prompt, not that it get immediate press, not that it build a reputation of tit for tat, but simply that it be devastatingly effective. And that often is at odds with its being prompt, with its being known immediately, and with its utilizing things that explode. I'll close with this. We ignore at our peril the ties between terrorism and what I believe is the central figure in this part of the world today, acting to the detriment of the United States, namely Saddam Hussein. Saddam is behaving now very much the way Stalin behaved after World War II began. He is cloaking himself in religion. Stalin discovered the excellence of the Russian Orthodox Church once he needed to rally the Russian people to fight the Germans. And Saddam now has decided that he is the friend of a powerful and strong Islam. Indeed, the Iraqi flag the writing on it in the white section is Saddam's calligraphy saying Allah Akbar, God is great. That would not be something that was done a few years ago. There are major figures in the Mideast. One is like the Shabilat, for example, the principal opposing figure now in prison in Jordan to King Hussein, who says such things as all is forgiven against Saddam because he is leading the jihad against the infidel. One thing we need to focus on very closely is potential ties between the government of Iraq and terrorism. The Iraqis were very active, probably still are, in the Sudan. Their ambassador had long ties to the Mukhabarat. There were many intelligence officers working for him there. And I believe that one of the biggest mistakes we have made in dealing with terrorism in the last number of years is that almost from the minutes the closing guns were being fired in the Gulf War in the spring of 1991, the United States policy with respect to Saddam has been flaccid and feckless. It is almost as if we became, in those closing days of the Gulf War, infected by a stupid virus with respect to Iraq, such that we would not protect the Shia when they were rebelling against Saddam in the South in the past administration. We responded to the attempt to assassinate President Bush with putting a few dozen cruise missiles on an empty building in the middle of the night. We have, and Mr. Chairman, I'm grateful to you and several other members of the committee for assisting me in trying to see that fairness is done to 6 Iraqis who struggled against Saddam. We seem to have taken on the view, and certainly the resignation of Mr. Ritter is front and center on this matter, we seem to have taken on the view as a nation that we are going to be appeasing to Saddam and hard on the people who have been opposing him. And something is sadly and massively wrong with our policy regarding Iraq. I believe that the terrorists in the Mideast understand that. I believe the potential alliances between Saddam and them are going to be an important part of what we see in the future and perhaps what we have seen in the past. And I think this matter deserves attention by this committee and the Congress and by the executive branch of the government at the highest levels. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Well, we have a little bit to chew on from these witnesses. I'm going to be, I'd like to make this a little bit more informal than usual since there are 3 of us here. I'll ask one question and then just turn to Senator Thompson, turn to Senator Sessions, and ask both of you to interject whatever thoughts you have at the appropriate time. Let me begin by asking both of you to comment on something. Last month, President Clinton signed an executive order freezing any U.S. assets owned by Osama bin Laden or his organization. And the order also prohibits U.S. firms and individuals from doing business with him. Probably won't have much effect, but it does enable the United States to approach other governments to urge similar steps. As you know, the Senate has been debating the issue of how, when, and why sanctions should be imposed against individuals or countries that commit acts against the interest of the United States. And clearly, our strategy with respect to terrorism is implicated in this debate. Under pending legislation entitled the Sanctions Policy Reform Act, the executive order on bin Laden would be considered a sanction. If this act today were law, the President would have had to do the following things under this legislation. 1, provide a 45-day notice before the order could be implemented. 2, automatically terminate the order within 2 years. 3, provide for contract sanctity in the event bin Laden, his lieutenants, or his Islamic Army organization had any contracts in the United States. 4, submit reports to Congress prior to implementing the order. 5, await reports from the Secretary of Agriculture before allowing the order to take effect. Question: does it make any sense to you that the President would have to undertake those steps prior to imposing such a sanction? In your experience, are there times when imposing sanctions is a useful tool to achieve foreign and defense policy objectives? And finally, another aspect of the Sanctions Policy Reform Act is that it encourages the United States to impose sanctions only pursuant to a multilateral regime. In your experience, are there times when the United States should be prepared to act alone? Ambassador Kirkpatrick?
Yes, yes, absolutely. Those are excellent questions. Of course, it would be a mistake to require that the President comply with all the provisions that you have just shared with us. It would guarantee the failure of the intention of the sanctions that were being imposed. It's perfectly, the assumption is that we impose sanctions only in serious situations where we seek seriously to handicap some group or some country, some government, in the achievement of and fulfillment of some policy which we regard as noxious and dangerous. And in that case, it seems clear that the group whom we would seek to sanction does not deserve the various considerations which that legislation would provide them, including ample, adequate notice. I would say that those provisions read as if they were written by a strong opponent of the use of sanctions as a tool of foreign policy. There are today a growing number of opponents of the use of sanctions as a tool of foreign policy, and so I think that would not be useful.
Thank you. Dr. Woolsey?
Mr. Chairman, I think obviously in a case such as Mr. bin Laden, restrictions of that sort are ridiculous. And the Act, however it reads, in my judgment, should not apply to terrorists or terrorist states. I do think that as the United States has moved in recent years, sometimes through the Congress, sometimes through the executive branch, to use sanctions so much, to the point where I read somewhere the other day, over half the world's population, maybe approaching 2/3 of the world's population, is somehow now under sanctions, economic sanctions by the United States. I think we've rather overdone it, and the importance of dealing with a problem such as the former South Africa or Mr. Milosevic and the like needs to be multilateral. I think the sanctions need to be multilateral in order to be effective. But I draw a line between even despicable governments such as the apartheid regime in South Africa and Milosevic's Serbia and clear state sponsorship of terrorism. I think in terrorist situations, the handful of countries and individuals that are clearly on a list of sponsoring terrorism, we need really to take the gloves off, and the types of decision-making that one needs to go through to say, are our sanctions against Cuba going to be effective unless we can get our allies to go along with us? Those are legitimate questions of foreign policy, but Mr. bin Laden and the government of Iraq, they don't deserve that type of consideration, I don't believe.
Thank you, and I would note, as far as I'm concerned, the sanctions automatically applied to Pakistan are a good example of an unwise decision, and one of the reasons why a lot of us are involved in trying to craft legislation to have a better policy with respect to sanctions. I guess my point in asking the question was to illustrate that no one-size-fits-all approach is going to work, and both of you have responded, I think, very effectively to that point. Let me turn to Senator Thompson first, then Senator Session, and I have more, too, that I'd like to engage you in if we could for another, at least as long as you're available. Thank you.
Yeah, it seems to me, Mr. Chairman, the problem has been with regard to our sanction policies that we've made no real distinction between countries that pose a threat to us and countries who do not.
That's right.
Pretty basic, you would think. Director Woolsey, I especially appreciate your comments on Iraq. It's unfortunate sometimes it's the latter part of these hearings that are the best when the TV cameras, most of them have gone. But I think that's very important. It seems to me like that this Ritter problem points out the fact that our fundamental problem down there has to do with our allies and loss of support, and that in turn has to do with what they perceive as loss of respect for the United States because of our Iraqi policy. It's not that they want to cozy up to Saddam, it's that they think he's going to win in the end, and it's a real problem. What I'd like to do is, Ambassador Kirkpatrick and both of you for that matter, to comment on one question. You, Ambassador, you made the reference to the post-World War I situation. It got me to thinking in terms of Germany. Hitler came about because of a number of things, one of which the resentment because of what was imposed on them after World War I. The other very much had to do with economics. And I was wondering, in looking at the South Asia situation today and the economic turmoil that we're having today, whether or not that is posing a vulnerability to the takeover, maybe, that you were referring to of some of these governments, somewhat similar to the extremist takeover in the aftermath that we saw prior to World War II.
Well, I think it's very clear that economic chaos, upheaval, and grave difficulty is a factor that can destabilize a society and destabilize people's affections for their government. I think that actually economic depression and dramatic political change also is destabilizing, because it throws into question all matters of legitimacy, and provide both of those factors were present, I think, in that period after World War I, when small bands of violent men were able to seize power, espousing very extremist philosophies, ideologies, and to gain the power of government then to implement those philosophies. That's, I worry about the destabilization and instability in South Asia. And I think that's I know that some peoples in South Asia consider themselves particularly vulnerable to extremist Islamist appeals, and have been especially sensitive to these in the period since the revolution, as they call it, came to Iran. And they're relatively nearby. And I also know that, because they have told me at some length about the agents that Iran has fed into some of the South Asian societies, which to proselytize for more extremist versions of Islam in universities and trade unions and the organized groups of the society. I have no doubt that the economic crises today in that area exacerbate those vulnerabilities. Yes, you're right, I think. Yeah.
Well, Senator Thompson, I think that the question's right on the money. I think that it's very important for people to realize that, in 1929, Hitler was just a failed putschist with a few thousand followers. He was nowhere close to as important as, say, Le Pen is in France today. It was the failure of the Kreditanstalt, the oncoming of the Depression, and within 4 short years, he was chancellor with a third of the German people behind him. The really troubling situation in Europe today, in Eastern Europe, of course, is that Russia looks increasingly like Weimar Germany, perhaps in the late 20s, with the exception that Weimar Germany had a lot more experience with the rule of law and parliamentary democracy than Russia does, and Weimar Germany didn't have any nuclear weapons. But in the part of the world that you're talking about, South Asia, the paper this morning, this excellent finance minister and deputy prime minister of Malaysia, Anwar Ibrahim, who is the future of moderation and parliamentary government and economic sense in that country, has been fired by the prime minister, and the prime minister is turning toward sealing Malaysia off from the world and authoritarian crackdowns on the press and all the like, even more than he has in the past. The country that I think we need, again, to be most concerned about soonest in this regard in part because the devastatingly bad economic situation can interact with a movement politically very sharply away from the directions we would like, is Pakistan. It is not irrelevant that the economic situation there, in part as a result of the sanctions, is very bad, and that the Prime Minister is proposing to turn towards
Correct
Sharia.
me if I'm wrong, but that's not a situation where the fundamentalists are taking over. It's a situation where the elected government is turning itself over in response to what it sees going on.
Exactly, exactly. It's I mean, Pakistan is a complex country, and there are people who are opposed to it, and there are real Democrats in Pakistan, and there are patriotic Pakistanis in some numbers who would oppose this, but it's a very dangerous situation.
Senator, may I just say
Yes,
that
please.
we've lived through a situation somewhat like this, of course, a few months ago, a year or two ago, in Turkey. And Turkey will be confronting elections again as well. A country, if you speak of a country on a kind of edge, where there are extremist Islamist groups who abhor the West and all of us, confronting principal political leaders who are democratic and pro-Western and represent rule of law and seek it for their country. And these, Turkey is, of course, also a NATO country. That's, Pakistan has been a very close ally, as Dr. Woolsey has emphasized. The time for us to be concerned about these countries is now, you know, before they fall off the edge, as it were. The time for us to take positive steps is now. That's, they are also targets of terrorism.
Senator Sessions, before I turn to you, let me just follow up on that one bit. One can name other countries, too. Egypt is in a very vulnerable position. Jordan, Algeria, other countries that were mentioned before. And might I just make this observation? If you want to respond, fine. But Saudi Arabia was discussed earlier. And these are countries where it's very difficult for them to do exactly what the United States wants exactly when we want it done.
Okay.
And it seems to me, as with Pakistan and the Pressler Amendment, we've got to be very careful not to do the wrong thing, as well as to try to do a lot of right things. One of the things that's being suggested in a very well-meaning way by colleagues who want to fight terrorism just as much as everyone else, is to begin to impose some kind of sanctions or limit U.S. cooperation with Saudi Arabia in some way. And it seems to me we need to be very, very careful about doing that because of the excellent point that you made in your opening statement. If either of you would like to respond to that, please do, and then I'll turn to Senator Sessions.
Yes. Just yes, all right. I think that was well put.
Okay, thank you.
I completely agree.
Senator Sessions?
Well, I have supported the President on these recent attacks and stated I did not and could not believe they were for political reasons. But I've been somewhat uneasy about the precise wisdom that was employed here. And your testimony, Mr. Woolsey, has heightened my unease. It seems to me, I was a federal prosecutor for a long time, when you had penetrated a drug organization, the biggest decision, one of the biggest, was when to take it down. Are they all together? Who's going to be hurt? What's the best time? When it can be most effective, most devastating to that organization? When are the leaders there? When can they all be eliminated, the head of the monster taken down? And I have the impression and concern, and I'll just ask you, are you expressing a similar concern in your remarks that with regard to the Afghanistan, that we did not have sufficient intelligence and not a clear enough mission to justify the actions that we took?
Well, we may well have had sufficient intelligence, Senator Sessions. I'm, just based on the press reports about those two Pakistani related camps near Coast, I would have questions about the wisdom of hitting those camps. Again, I do not question hitting Mr. bin Laden's camp. Mr. bin Laden deserves everything we can give him. But I think that it's important.
But we did not get Mr. bin Laden.
As far as we know, we didn't get Mr. bin Laden. I think it's important that in a matter of that kind, the public impression, the looking toward the PR of the whole thing, looking to the Sunday talk shows and making sure nobody criticizes you for taking no action, all of those considerations belong in last place, not first place. I've been in the federal government 4 times, and I'm not naive enough to believe that one never considers matters of that sort in making decisions of this kind. But I think those considerations should come along at the end. The thing that matters most is exactly what you said with respect to taking down a criminal organization with an arrest, is how can you do it most effectively? And I just find in reading the press on these, sort of scratching my head, asking myself why we would hit, if the facts are correct in the press, why we would hit 2 camps of that sort. And also, I think that if there was good reason to hit Mr. bin Laden's camp at the time we did, fine. There's nothing wrong with promptness if promptness works. But as I said, sometimes in a military strike of that sort, one wants to make absolutely sure that you have all your ducks in a row, and sometimes it takes more time than press and columnists and newspaper reporters are willing to allow you, and if so, I think you just take the heat and do it right.
Well, it does seem to me we had extraordinary penetration, extraordinary information about the group, much of which they probably were not aware that we knew. Now we've had to tell the world why we did it, and we've revealed a lot of our information, and it may be more difficult in the future to accomplish what we'd like. And I think when you take on a target and you, in effect, violate a nation's sovereignty, you ought to have an important target in mind, and you ought to hit it and accomplish it. And when you haven't, it's not an acceptable or a worthwhile endeavor, it seems to me. And I think in addition to not having had, according to the New York Times, as you noted, personal communication with the Director of Central Intelligence, we learned today that apparently the opinion of the FBI director who had been investigating this organization was not also asked for, and apparently not passed to the President before he made his decision, which troubles me. And like you, as a prosecutor, I found that talking to the agents in the field before you made a decision, you made good decisions then. The further away you get, the less good your decisions were.
Could I follow up?
Certainly, Senator Thompson.
From what I understand, they apparently thought that bin Laden and some of the other leaders were going to be there.
I know nothing about that other than what I've seen in the press, Senator Thompson.
But if that's the case and they weren't, then that kind of gets back to your human intelligence question again, doesn't it?
It is awfully difficult.
And I also understand, there's been no assessment, as far as I know, about what was done or how effective it was or what was destroyed or how many people were killed.
Again,
Isn't that a little strange that we don't know that by now? And unless there's something I've missed.
Getting information in real time from that part of the world in that kind of fine-grained detail about individuals is very difficult. It's also hard to find individuals. I lived through our effort to find Mr. Aidid in Mogadishu, and we had a lot of people there, some on the ground, a lot in the military, some intelligence, and we came awfully close to finding him several times. But we were right there, and it still was very, very hard. So tracking people halfway around the world and knowing in real time where they are and what they're doing is very difficult for intelligence to do. Tom Clancy's fascinating novels to the contrary notwithstanding, it's pretty difficult to sit out there, I'd say it's impossible to sit out there at Langley and watch terrorists in camps and tell the difference between the long-haired ones and the short-haired ones as they do in Patriot games. It doesn't work that way.
If I could, Senator Thompson, if I could just interject something here because of an intelligence briefing that we received yesterday, and I'm not going to be revealing anything that isn't appropriate, but I'll tell you what happened. Very proudly, the briefers came up and spent a lot of time with some great-looking photographs. A lot of fun to look at. Look at all these hardened tents that we blew up. They were great photographs. And a lot of time was spent showing how the cruise missile landed right on top of this adobe structure and blew it apart. When it was all done, the question was, so, did we get them? Well, I don't know about that. Now, obviously, I'm shortening the answer on the don't know about. We can't get into that here. But it points up the fact that sometimes the greatest expensive technological assets that we bring to bear don't tell us what we really need to know about terrorists. And I think one of the things I take from this hearing is the point that both of you has made, but especially Director Woolsey, that there is no substitute for human intelligence, number one. Number two, that it's expensive. Number three, that it's hard. And number four, that sometimes you have to recruit unsavory characters. And that to some extent the Congress has impeded that ability. Might I ask this question I said I would ask in my opening statement? From what you know, is it important for us to apply more resources to intelligence, and in particular human intelligence, meaning increase the budget authority there?
I very definitely think so, Mr. Chairman. Intelligence has largely been cut by sort of attrition over the years. The budget for the last decade has stayed fairly fixed. It's come down in real terms substantially over that time. And I think that there are a number of very able people in the intelligence community, and they're working very hard, and they have had some recent successes. I frankly think this soil sample, the analysis they did was right, and I think they served the country well under very difficult circumstances in doing that. But it is expensive and dangerous and difficult to collect intelligence on terrorist operations, and countries like Afghanistan and Iran and halfway around the world without many Americans present in them and the like. I saw somewhere the other day, I forget who said it, it was some government official, I believe in the executive branch, that the reason the intelligence budget needed to be cut yet again was because the military budget was going down. And my reaction to that is, a mathematician friend of mine uses the expression, he says, well, they got the relationship right, but the sign wrong. It's true that intelligence ought to be related to military expenditures, but to the extent you're cut back on your military expenditures, you better be smarter rather than dumber. If I could use one historical example, even though he was badly outnumbered for at least a couple of years, Robert E. Lee's, one of his greatest advantages over the series of Union generals that he had to fight against was his cavalry, Jeb Stuart, which was the intelligence of the Army of Northern Virginia. And the victories at Fredericksburg and 2nd Manassas and Chancellorsville had a lot to do with intelligence, even though he was outnumbered. When he lost Stuart through Stuart's own decision of spending time riding out around the Union Army at the time of Gettysburg, and he was blind, he lost Gettysburg. And I think that it is very important for policymakers to understand that as military resources are declining, to make the argument that therefore intelligence resources ought to decline, it is not just a little bit off, it is 180 degrees off as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you. Senator Sessions?
I would like to ask a question, maybe both of you could comment on this. With regard to international law and the difficulties of making an attack as we did, do you see any difference in using a manned aircraft that could devastate the targets better, or perhaps even a commando organization. There may be a degree, I admit, but if the target is serious enough and important enough that we should take it out, we should we not be sure that we are successful in that effort?
If I might, I would like to refer to another historical example. Much of the discussion about this attack has reminded me, reasonably enough, of the Reagan administration's decision to bomb chemical weapons facilities and certain other installations in Libya. And we thought there were large chemical plants. We had a lot of evidence that there were large plants producing chemicals that would have been appropriate for chemical weapons. We used manned aircraft, if you will. We lost the men in one of those planes on that mission. Some of our allies and friends would not, namely France, would not permit our planes to overfly utilize their airspace. However, Great Britain and Mrs. Thatcher permitted our planes to take off from Britain. When that attack was finished, there was a lot of question, above all in the media and the most responsible press, about what we had hit and whether a lot of protests that it was an illegal unilateral American use of force. And a lot of suggestion that we hadn't hit what we intended to. And that, among other things, we hadn't hit Gaddafi. And we didn't know how much damage we had done. And therefore, we couldn't really assess the effectiveness of the attack. And for obvious reasons, it's an example that weighs with me, because experience since that attack on Libya has suggested that it was very effective in, if not in permanently removing the threat in the Libyan government, at least in quieting him and dampening somewhat his enthusiasm for attacks on Americans. Before our air attack on Libyan installations, which apparently closely missed him too, he was attacking Americans on a fairly regular basis, American lives and property. Since then, he has, in fact, not. He's behaved so discreetly that
you also
we're not
produced
so
the
aware
evidence of what he was doing, too.
We also produced the evidence of what he was doing, that's right. But I would like to say, we've had quite a bit of experience in our government in trying to identify where particular people are in relationship to attacks. It's very difficult to know where particular persons are and at any given time, and especially where they're going to be in another 24 hours or 12 hours. Even if you have people on the ground, you may not know where a Saddam Hussein is from one day to the next, because he moves around a great deal. And moreover, there are a good many people who are always eager to demonstrate the inefficacy of the use of force to deal with such a problem by demonstrating or purporting to demonstrate that it wasn't really effective at all, didn't really achieve anything that it intended to achieve. I think that we will confront legal questions about the legitimacy of the use of force without Security Council authorization, for example. We will confront issues even when the United States claims self-defense or collective self-defense. That claim may be rejected. I think that there are a good many people today in the international law community who are profoundly hostile to any use of force. They were profoundly hostile to any use of force at all. Now they're profoundly hostile to any use of force, which at least was not thoroughly approved by the Security Council. And yet any approval, any any use of force approved by the Security Council is very likely not to succeed if the UN were also going to authorize it, implement it as well as authorize it. So I think this is going to be a problem that we're going to be confronting from now on, in fact, and I think it's very important that Americans be clear that the legitimacy of our actions by our government rests finally, as we see it, on the legitimacy of our own government and its responsibility to the American people.
Senator Sessions, this is a very important and difficult question. Where I come out on it is that short of a struggle for national existence, such as we had essentially in World War II, I don't think the United States should get into the business of trying to kill specific individuals. I think that it makes our own people and leaders even more a target than they otherwise would be. I think it undermines a lot of what the United States stands for in the world to a lot of people. But there's no question that there is a certain irony to the fact that one can send bombers or cruise missiles over an area to kill a lot of people in an area where some individual might be, and also sort of hope that he might be there, but still not send in someone to shoot him with a gun. I'm willing to live with that irony because I think there are bigger downsides to repealing the Ford-era executive order and going into, directly or indirectly, the assassination business. But I would say this. In World War II, we essentially assassinated Admiral Yamamoto. We did it with P-38s. We broke the Japanese codes. We knew where he was going to be in a Japanese aircraft. We sent the aircraft up to shoot down his aircraft. They got him. He was the architect of Pearl Harbor, and it was a clear assassination. It's just that we used P-38s instead of some individual doing it with a gun. And there's very good evidence, I believe, that toward the end of World War II, in December of '44, in Switzerland, the OSS gave the authority to an amazing individual, Mo Berg, an OSS officer who had been a Red Sox catcher, by the way, to assassinate Heisenberg, the great German physicist, if Berg decided, hearing his lecture and talking to him, that he was in fact supporting a German nuclear program. Heisenberg and Berg talked, and Berg decided that Heisenberg was not supporting an effective German nuclear weapons program. Turned out to be right, by the way, did not kill him, and let him go away. In wartime, to the death, essentially, in something like the struggle against Nazism, the U.S. government probably has to get into making those kinds of decisions. But short of that, and I don't think we are there yet, I don't believe it should be the policy of the U.S. government to use its intelligence agencies or otherwise to get into the business of targeting and killing specific individuals.
Well, I recognize that, and I guess my comment and thought is if there's a worthy target there, let's hit the target. If we're going to kill some low-level soldier, it doesn't bother me that we kill the general in the process. Yes. But really my question was, if that was a good target and worthy of destruction, do you see a problem with using manned aircraft as opposed to cruise missiles, which I think are particularly difficult to ascertain what you've accomplished?
I think aircraft, particularly such as the B-2, which presumably could operate without being shot down in areas of that sort, is something that we ought to very seriously consider. And if we have support from governments in an area, the most effective thing one might be able to do would be to launch some sort of commando raid to attack an area and hopefully to grab some of these individuals, particularly ones for whom the United States had warrants out, to bring them back. I think operations of that sort, whereas they're very difficult, sometimes can be done. And the Israelis have done it, and we have done it on occasion. So the British have done it on occasion. So I think that all of those things are tools that the President and the country can legitimately use in what we are moving into, which really is something very, very close to a war against terrorism.
Might I conclude with one statement to Ambassador Kirkpatrick, one question to Director Woolsey, and then I'll close the hearing unless you have anything else, Senator Sessions. Reading from the statement of the President on August 20th, he said that radical groups associated with and funded by Osama bin Laden killed American, Belgian, and Pakistani peacekeepers in Somalia. That was the extent of his exact statement, but I think others expanded the exact operations where that occurred. I had asked Director Free earlier, and I realize this is one small element, although it's been effective in a couple of really key cases. We have a $2 million statutory limit on the reward that the CIA or other operatives can issue with respect to the capture of terrorists or other criminals. In the case of Osama bin Laden, you might need a little greater incentive than that. Do you think we might productively increase that level somewhat?
I think Mr. bin Laden could see that $2 million bet and raise it more than once.
Yeah.
I think it would probably be quite advisable to be able to pay more than that if you're trying to get him arrested and brought to justice, which would be a wonderful thing.
Right. Now, some people say, well, no, I guess I won't get into that. If you have any recommendations about how much or other details, please pass those on to us. I think if I could just summarize this, the second part of this hearing today, it was enormously helpful to me. I think a lot of us are going to need to go back and reflect on what the two of you have told us. I think starting out with the observation that, as I said, should have been apparent, but I think it's escaped a lot of us until you put it so clearly, Ambassador Kirkpatrick, that we start with the fundamental notion that in fighting terrorism, we need to ensure that countries that could harbor terrorists and sponsor terrorists need to be prevented from doing that, hopefully with our assistance, and certainly by not having the United States do anything negative that would adversely affect those countries' ability to fight terrorism. So A, stop them from becoming states sponsored by terrorism, and B, I think also do everything we can to prevent the kind of influence that terrorists can have over those governments, even though they may not fundamentally take them over. And then secondly, the points that Director Woolsey primarily made about intelligence gathering, its application, the kinds of things we've got to be able to do in this murky world of dealing with terrorism. With terrorists, and I especially appreciated your statement, your formulation of our statement with respect to Iraq, flaccid and feckless. With your permission, I will borrow that and use it.
It's an honor, Mr. Chairman.
I concur in it, even though I couldn't have come up with quite as good a formulation. I think all of that is very, very good. And what we as members of Congress, I know, are willing to do is to work with the administration. We certainly support the goal of the strikes that we're engaged in. I think all of us immediately came to the administration's, I shouldn't say defense, but supported the action that was taken, even though we might have some disagreement about precisely what was done or when. We are willing to cooperate with the administration in developing an effective strategy. But a strategy, I think, implies two things. One, it implies more than just a reactive policy. It implies a coherent, well-thought-out, long-term set of goals and actions that can achieve those goals. And secondly, that policy has to be very consistent. It cannot, on the one hand, try to take out a chemical weapon plant, but on the other hand, close its eyes to the people who are developing the expertise to build and develop the chemicals in that plant, as we appear to be doing in Iraq. So we will certainly work with the administration. We would appreciate your continued advice on the best ways to help develop that strategy, and from the standpoint of Congress, provide the resources that Congress needs to supply in order to make sure that it's properly executed. Again, thank you both very much for being with us today. We'll appreciate working with you in the future.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And if there's nothing else, this hearing is adjourned.